Welcome to this special meeting of the Santa Barbara City Council. Today is Thursday, February 11th. We are doing a budget work session. We'll start with a Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Ms. Clerk, would you do a roll call? Thank you.
Certainly. Councilmember Alejandro Gutierrez. Councilmember Harmon, I believe is absent. Councilmember Snedden. Here. Councilmember Friedman.
Here.
Councilmember Jordan.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Oscar Gutierrez.
Present.
Mayor Maria.
Here. Thank you very much. If you would read the item into the record, we will hear a presentation from staff and then we'll do public comment. Ms. Clerk, thank you.
Very good. Item 1, budget work session for fiscal year 2022.
Very good. Mr. Casey, are you starting us off? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Madam Mayor and council members. Good afternoon. Thank you for attending today's work session on the budget. This is something we do on an annual basis about this time of year. Give you a deep dive into our budget situation, our fiscal outlook for the upcoming year, and get any initial thoughts or guidance from you all. It's a work session, so there's no formal votes that go here, but it does help if you feel we're heading in the right direction on some of our assumptions and workloads. If we could go to the next slide, please. So here's the agenda for today. I will turn this over to our finance director, Mr. Keith DeMartini. He will run you through an understanding and overview of the city's financial structure and understanding how the funds work and that sort of stuff. We'll talk about enterprise funds. So this is a challenging budget year, not a surprise to anyone. And what is unique is that there's a lot of challenges across different funds based upon the COVID-19 pandemic and revenue impacts to multiple funds. So we're going to spend a little time on the enterprise funds and talking about those that are struggling. So you have an awareness of that. But we'll spend most of the time on the general fund, which is what we usually do. The general fund is the fund that pays for our police, fire, libraries, parks and recreation, and other general government purposes. We'll run through revenues, expenditures, and look at our multi-year forecast, making the best assumptions that we can for now, and do the budget processing calendar. And then I'll wrap up at the end with a discussion about the workload that we're all working on, both on a policy level and administrative level, that I think shows the great work that is happening across all your departments, and to give you a sense of the scope and breadth of what we're working on, and make sure that we are focused where you want to be with some of the key themes going there. We thought we would take a pause for questions after we finish the enterprise funds. So a little break up in the presentation, and then go into the general fund, and we could take questions there. And then I can do workload priorities at the end. And we'll see how we're going timing wise about when we might want to take a break, Madam Mayor, as you always suggest. We take one about 2 hours in, but we're shooting to be done by 4, but leaving ample time for your input and guidance. So enjoy, please ask questions, and let us know. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. DeMartini.
Great, thank you so much, Mr. Casey. Good afternoon, Madam Mayor, members of the City Council. I'm Keith DeMartini. It's my pleasure to serve as your Finance Director. And I'm very excited to be here with you today and looking forward to the kickoff of our budget process this upcoming fiscal year. Next slide, please. So before I jump into an overview in order to gain a shared understanding of the city's finances and its financial structure, I wanted to ensure that the City Council, as well as the public, understand that we have a great deal of information publicly available really at any time through our website. Here's a page on our website in regards to where the public can find information about our revenues, our annual financial reports, our budget, a number of other documents are publicly available really at any time. Next slide, please. The city also has a really powerful financial transparency tool where any member of the public, again, could go onto this tool and they can identify a number of different filters and slice and dice our budget information in ways that might be important to them. So this is a tool that's out there, that's publicly available. We encourage folks to use it if they have any questions or are just interested in understanding where our money goes. Next slide, please. So before I kind of jump into the bulk of the enterprise funds and really a great amount of detail on our general fund, I wanted to make sure that we have a shared understanding of how sort of government, financial, and accounting and budget information works, sort of compared to maybe the private sector. So next slide, please, Jen. So in the public sector, the budget is one of the most important documents, and it's one of the most important actions that any public body could take during the year. It is a legal document, and that document communicates to the world what the priorities are for the city. And it's done through the budget process, where deliberations will occur with the city council and with the public, and we determine the city council determines where those funds should be spent in any given year. The budget is very restrictive in the sense that the city council authorizes the appropriation to occur. Appropriation is sort of a fancy word for the budget. And what it does is it specifically will allocate money based on the city council's priority of where that money should be spent. And that money is authorized through the appropriation process by individual funds, by individual departments, and also by specific projects. And we're going to go into some detail about why that's important and how that works during the budget process and during the annual sort of normal course of business. Next slide, please. So this graphic here shows sort of the annual cycle of the budget process and how it's sort of this never-ending loop. And on the top right is where we are today in this annual process with budget preparation. Staff have already been working for a few months, getting ready for this presentation today, as well as talking about and considering changes and proposals for the upcoming budget cycle that staff will then be presenting to the city council during the months of April, May, and June, where you'll have your deliberations and staff will be available to answer questions and work with you through those budget proposals. The council will adopt the budget in June, and then it comes time to implement. Staff get to work and we implement the budget based on the priorities that the city council have laid out for staff. And then there's this continual monitoring process and a feedback process in regards to doing continuous monitoring on a quarterly basis of how we're doing financially, as well as a very formal, robust audit process to ensure that we're complying with all the rules, laws, and regulations of federal, state, and local agencies where we have money and do work in coordination with them. And we'll bring that our report to you on an annual basis. So that's sort of the annual flow of the cycle. And then we get right back into budget development. Next slide, please. So government finance is complicated. It's not as simple as accounting and private sector. And the reason why it's complicated is because money that comes to a city like ours comes from different places. We have a number of general fund tax revenues. We also receive grants from federal and state agencies for specific purposes. And there's many, many other examples that I could draw from. But the government fund accounting is how we track all of that money and how we spend it. And they're basically set up on different ledgers. And so we track money coming in and money going out on different funds on the city's financial statements. Next slide, please. Fund accounting is a relatively new phenomenon and how robust and how controlling it is for public sector accounting. And it really has it's very standardized in regards to how states and counties and cities report their financial information on our financial statements. It was really born out of a great amount of public outcry that occurred in sort of early 1900s, and a lot of additional control mechanisms have been put in place over the decades since then. And really what it came down to was there wasn't adequate controls in place on how funds were being used for specific purposes. They were being kind of commingled. And so the sort of the outcome of that was funds and accounting had to be placed into separate buckets and separate funds so that we can adequately track and hold folks accountable for how those funds are to be spent. And as we go through the presentation today, you'll see why that's important and how we have managed to comply with all those laws and regulations here in the city of Santa Barbara. Next slide, please. I also want to make sure that the council and the public are aware that we do a great deal of work with our budget process, and we hold ourselves, staff, to a high degree of accountability and a high standard for ensuring that the budget document itself is as easily readable as possible, and that we are transparent with the information that we produce in that budget document, that we have a number of public meetings where we discuss with the public about the priorities and the money coming in and the money going out. We track performance metrics, and we do our best to make it as easily readable as possible. And the city has been awarded for its presentation of the budget in recent years, and we will continue to strive for excellence in our budget process. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to go into the next section of the presentation today, which is going to provide first an overview of the different types of funds that we track here in Santa Barbara, which is very similar to many cities throughout the state. And then once I do that, to sort of provide a base level of understanding on the different types of funds, we're going to then spend quite a bit of time on the enterprise funds, as the city administrator indicated earlier. So next slide, please. There are 4 major types of funds in governmental accounting. And by far the largest fund that we have here in this city is our general fund. That's what City Administrator Casey mentioned earlier. It's primarily used for public safety and other community-related functions. The next largest types of funds are our enterprise funds. And those funds operate more like a business. And I'll go into quite a bit of detail about what our enterprise funds are and how they operate. And then we have a few other funds that are much smaller. They're both internal service funds and special revenue funds, which I'll explain and define later on in this presentation. So next slide, please. So first, our general fund. Again, it's our largest fund here at the city. It is our primary operating fund. really for every government has a general fund for the most part. It is used and accounts for services that serve the general public at large. It really provides the most general public benefit. And that's why the majority of public safety functions for police and fire are primarily funded through the general fund. The primary revenue that comes into the general fund are tax revenues. For us, that includes property tax, sales tax, the hotel tax, and a few other ones, which I'll describe in detail later on in the presentation. It also accounts for a few other services that aren't necessarily taxes, but might actually be subsidized by some tax revenue. And an example of that includes services provided in our community development department for permits that developers might need for any development projects, and also recreation classes. Those are examples of some services that are partially subsidized by tax revenues. Next slide, please. The next major type of fund that I mentioned earlier are our enterprise funds. Enterprise funds, again, operate more like a business. There are no tax revenues that go into our enterprise funds that fund those operations. They are primarily and entirely funded through user fees. And an example of this is our water fund. People pay water rates for water service for residential and commercial. Those water rates entirely fund not only the operation of ensuring that water delivery occurs, but it also funds capital improvements to our water infrastructure. Those revenues that come in through enterprise funds, like our water enterprise, they're restricted. And that's an important word here. It means that we cannot commingle those funds that we receive, the revenues that come in, for other purposes. So for example, someone pays their utility bill, and we get revenue into our water fund. That revenue cannot be used to put on a recreation class. That's not a legal use of that revenue coming in. So that's where governmental fund accounting comes into play. We're very, very clear and have discrete policies and procedures here at this city that ensures that the money that comes in is used for the specific and intended in legal purpose that it's meant to be used for. Next slide, please. So the next set of the next fund type that I want to describe and define to you is what we call internal service funds. And so the operations that are accounted for in our internal service funds, those are operations that support other city departments. So they're kind of meant to be a support entity that offer support services so that they can do their business. And an example of that is our facilities department. Facilities staff maintain and enhance the buildings where city staff work from. Another example is custodial services. We have people that perform custodial services that, again, it's necessary and required. And so those services support other city departments. So the way that internal service funds work is those departments that perform an internal service, they receive revenue from other departments that rely on them for service. And so the costs of the custodial staff are kind of spread throughout all the other departments that they serve. So that's really how an internal service fund or an internal service department works. And that's been proven to be sort of an operationally efficient model that many cities have used throughout the years, and which we use here as well. Next slide, please. The next and final fund type that I want to make sure that I define for the City Council and the public today are what we call special revenue funds. Special revenue funds are very, very restrictive. They're given or they come to the city for a very specific purpose, and they can only be used for that specific purpose. So an example of this, a really good example, is a grant. So the city has been very successful in being awarded grants throughout the years for very specific projects, some of which are related to housing services, transportation, other services like that as well. And so we record those in really specific funds and accounts, and we track those expenses. And we also have very strict reporting requirements to those granting agencies to ensure that we are spending those monies in line with the grant agreements that we have. I want to move on to the next slide, please. This slide here just shows a summary of the city's budgeted positions in the current fiscal year. And so before we get into the enterprise funds and the general fund departments, I wanted to just provide an overview of where the just over 1,000 full-time equivalent budgeted positions, where they reside and where they work. And as you can see on this graph, more than half of the employees that work for the city either work in a public safety function, such as police and fire, or in public works, which again is in regards to streets and parking and water and wastewater and a number of other operations as well. And as you can see, the other slices of the pie are where the other city staff work. Next slide, please. So now that I've provided kind of a really brief overview and sort of defined the major fund types and the hierarchy, the sort of the high level fund and accounting structure in which we are required to operate. Now I want to first take the next part of this work session and go into a little bit of detail about each of the major enterprise funds that we have and what those operations are and what are some of the budgetary and financial considerations, sort of changes primarily for all of them related to COVID and the effects of COVID and recent stay-at-home orders. And then some of the initial thinking and the initial planning that has been underway actually for a number of months now that staff continue to be focused on, so that we are prepared to have a robust discussion with the City Council and the public about the impacts financially and budgetarily for each of those enterprises. So next slide, please. And the first enterprise that we'll be focusing on is the airport. So we're not unique that we operate an airport. And for us here in Santa Barbara, it's primarily when looking at just the finances, a property management business. And there are two distinct areas, really the aviation areas, which is south of Hollister, and then the non-aviation and commercial and industrial area, where a significant amount of revenue is generated through some of our lease operations on the airport property. Next slide, please. So this slide here shows the breakdown of the revenues coming into the airport fund. And as you can see, it's fairly diverse, but there are four primary revenue sources. Again, primarily through the leasing agreements that we have. That ranges from airlines with landing fees that we receive, fuel flowage fees, terminal space rental. There's also a number of concessionaires that lease space. And then there's also non-aviation related leases as well in the commercial and in the industrial area. As you can see, it's a fairly diverse but sort of equal share of the pie for the airport revenues. Next slide, please. So over the past year has been incredibly challenging for the airline industry at large. This graph here on the right-hand side of this slide shows the number of passengers on a monthly trend, starting as far back as December of 2018. And you can see the immediate drop to basically very, very little passenger activity at the airport in April of 2020, immediately following the outbreak of COVID. And you can see a little bit of gradual increase, but nowhere near the normal passenger levels that we would typically see at our airport. And then again, kind of a little bit of a drop off after the most recent stay-at-home order. The airport industry was fairly quick to receive federal stimulus from the federal government. We've received just over $12 million right now to help offset the losses from the reduced air traffic and air travel. But we will see how we are able to recover once things return to some sense of normalcy. Very exciting that Santa Barbara announced that Southwest Airlines will be launching daily service in just a few months here. And the airport continues to have a pretty high level of deferred maintenance and capital investment that continues to be a focus that we'll be planning for strategically in the upcoming fiscal year and beyond. Next slide, please. So the next major enterprise fund is our water fund, and I provided an example earlier. The water fund has a very robust, substantial capital program. And you can see here, there's a small list here of just a few of the capital projects and programs that are currently underway and will continue to be a focus in the upcoming fiscal year. That includes increasing the water main replacement funding for replacing and enhancing our water mains. There's a really large advanced metering infrastructure project that is currently underway, and that will have some really great customer service benefits as well. And then there's a large Cater treatment plant investment project. And again, there's many, many more, but this is just a sense of some of the capital investment projects that is a primary focus for the enterprise. As I mentioned earlier, the way that the enterprise is able to deliver on these capital investments, as well as just ensuring water gets to all residential and commercial customers, is through the rates that ratepayers pay. And there are rate increases that are currently being discussed publicly, both at the Water Commission and soon will be discussed at the Finance Committee about potential rate increases that will occur in the upcoming 3 fiscal years. And so there'll be more information coming about that as well. Next slide, please. So the next enterprise is the wastewater fund. And the wastewater fund operates very similarly to the water fund, which I just described. Again, it's a very, very capital intensive operation, ensuring that the maintenance of the city's wastewater infrastructure is maintained to sort of minimize any backflow or other issues that might occur. So there's a very heavy and strong focus on rehabilitation and various capacity improvements to ensure that the system works correctly. There's a few projects listed here, or some priority capital projects in the upcoming fiscal year. And there is already a rate increase that was scheduled to take effect on July 1st. And future conversations will be had publicly about the need for potential rate increases in the upcoming few fiscal years ahead. Next slide, please. Excuse me. So the next enterprise fund that I wanted to talk about is our solid waste fund. And our solid waste group is responsible for ensuring that the city's hauler and a number of other activities ensure the cleanliness of the city. And this slide lists three major focus areas for the solid waste fund, again, that are currently being focused on in a sort of a priority and strategic view going into the next fiscal year. And the first is climate resiliency. And really that's an area of focus with ensuring greenhouse gas emissions and regulations are adhered to in our city. The next is about neighborhood vibrancy and ensuring that clean Santa Barbara services and encampment management activities are occurring, minimizing illegal dumping and litter abatement and activities such as that. And then finally, staff ensure service accountability for the major service provider in Santa Barbara and ensuring that contract management and oversight is controlled and that we stay on top of it to ensure the cleanliness of the city. Next slide, please. So our solid waste fund is one of our smaller enterprises. It's around 32 million per year of an annual operating budget. 80% of the funds that come in are dedicated to long-term contracts, long-term agreements that we have in place for haulers to do collection, processing, and disposal services. The priorities for fiscal year 22 for solid waste include the resource center opening and oversight. They'll be starting and conducting a collection system review and preparation for new service contracts that will likely be in place beginning in 2023, but there's a substantial amount of work that has to occur leading up to a new contract beginning. And then there's also a new state organics implementation program requiring 75% diversion of organics in 2025. So there's a substantial amount of public education and work with the public to ensure that we are able to achieve those organic implementation standards. Next slide, please. So the next enterprise that I want to provide just a really brief overview of is our downtown parking fund. So as council is aware, the downtown parking group manages 5 parking structures and 10 surface lots and responsible for maintaining and operating those structures and those lots throughout the year. We operate this fund as an enterprise fund because the parking revenues that we get, again, on this graph here, primarily through the hourly parking programs, which accounts for 55% of the total amount of revenues. And you can see where the other revenue sources come from. Those revenues 100% pay for not only the annual sort of operating and maintenance of the parking structures and the parking lots, but also any capital improvements as well. So next slide, please. As council and the public are aware, there have been many challenges with sort of the financial solvency and the strength of the downtown parking fund. Again, primarily due to the impacts of COVID. We saw a dramatic decline of hourly parking and many other customers using the city's parking structures and parking lots. So staff is hard at work in developing and implementing a 5-year strategic plan for addressing downtown parking concerns in the future. And that includes restructuring the parking business and improvement area potentially, considering raising rates, considering eliminating the complimentary period that currently exists. Council heard an item a few months ago and received your approval to proceed with system automation, including the license plate reader program and online permitting and billing. And we think that over time that will prove to be a really good financial decision to ensure that we're recovering as much revenue as possible through parking operations. Again, revenues were hit very, very hard during COVID. And so the operation has had to dip into its reserves this year and is needing to dip into reserves probably in the next few years as they work through their 5-year strategic plan and reaching some new financial stability level. And staff will be working very closely on ensuring that occurs. Next slide, please. So the next enterprise is our golf fund. It's It's a rather small fund. It's just a few $1 million a year, about $3 million. The golf fund is primarily funded through green fees. So the users of the city's golf course primarily funds the operation for the golf fund. In recent years, there was a contractor that was brought on board to manage the operations and maintenance of the golf course. There were a few years where the golf fund was struggling financially as declines in play nationally kind of went down. But surprisingly, the golf fund has had a fairly healthy year financially because a lot more golf activity has occurred during COVID, during recent stay-at-home orders. It's a fairly safe activity for many people to participate in. So the golf fund has seen a fairly healthy year this year. Next slide, please. And so the final enterprise fund that I want to provide a really brief overview for is our waterfront fund. So this pie chart here on the left provides sort of an overview of the diversity of the revenues that go into our waterfront fund. As you can see, the largest pieces of the pie here, there's 3 of them. They primarily come from slip rentals for boats docked at the harbor, as well as leases that we operate with various businesses that operate their business on waterfront property. And then also there are a few parking lots that are directly associated with the waterfront and the harbor, and that makes up the remaining 20%. So those are the 3 primary and largest revenue sources that fund the waterfront operations. And those operations include maintaining all the facilities of the waterfront, which are very expensive to maintain. That includes the harbor, Stearns Wharf, the buildings, and the parking lots. It also includes making sure that we have adequate property management and parking staff available, the marina management, and harbor patrol. Next slide, please. So the waterfront, similar to downtown parking, was significantly hurt financially due to COVID. The city council took fairly immediate action to allow for a temporary eviction moratorium and a deferral of tenant rents, which was a significant amount of revenue that tenants were able to defer paying to the city. But what that required was the city to leverage and use reserves to continue to sustain operating services. So time will tell how the recovery is for many of these operations. We know that some cruise ships have already booked coming into Santa Barbara Harbor, and staff have still had to defer a number of waterfront capital projects, and will continue to consider that in the upcoming year. Other considerations are sea level rise, which was a recent conversation with the city council, and then replacements of various marinas. So that really concludes the summary of the enterprise funds. And next slide, please. This might be a good breaking point, Madam Mayor, for questions and discussion with the council.
Thanks, Mr. DiMartini. I know this is your first budget presentation. Going well. City council members, questions on the presentation so far? A lot of information there.
I have a question, Madam Mayor. Sorry, slow on that.
Yeah,
So just about, thank you, the for the city trash recycling, the priorities for fiscal year 2022, and so the diversion implementation for the organics. When do we expect the MRF to get working, and is that already in the budget that we're paying for the mechanical separation, or are we planning to have some other it sounded like there was a major education component, but I think maybe I misunderstood that we would all just be putting everything in the bins and then the MRF would be taking care of it.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Sutton, I'll give a try at taking care of that. The MRF is expected to take care of a part of that, but it's actually, there are additional components to the regulations that are coming forward in the new year, including food rescue, which is a part of the organics diversion. So there are multiple parts of it, and we will give you a good update on all of those when we come to you with our budget presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Sneddon. Other questions from the council? I had one about downtown parking. Mr. Dayton, are you there? You had given me some information, you expanded my knowledge of the kiosk workers and how many other jurisdictions had gone to automation 10 years ago, and we're all, loving our kiosketers. And could you just talk a little bit about how over time it was hard to put money in reserve through this division?
Certainly, Madam Mayor. We have, even before the pandemic, had an issue financially in downtown parking in that we have not raised the rates in over 10 years. And then we have not adjusted the complimentary period. Incidentally, that 75-minute complimentary period is worth about $5 million that the city of Santa Barbara Youth Council give the downtown. That complimentary period actually has a value. And so what we actually were looking at automation the downtown parking committee had already had automation in the plan and in the works. So when the pandemic hit, that caused an acceleration. The reason is we need to throw off a certain amount of money into the reserves every year in order to maintain the facilities. And we were down to not throwing off much money at all every year. So the pandemic kind of was the final straw, if you will. Does that help, Madam Mayor?
Yeah, thanks. I just think people need to know that that we valued that customer service element, and but there's a bigger picture and a loss of $2.5 million a year if we kept things going, if I have that right. So thanks for that.
That is right. That is our projected loss for this year will be 2.5 million.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Mr. DeMartini, I think we're ready to keep going. So next would be the general fund.
Yes, very good, Madam Mayor. Thank you very much. So now I'd like to turn our attention to the city's general fund, again, which is the city's largest fund. And what I'd like to do over the next number of slides is I'm going to provide a really brief overview of some of the recent trends going on in our general fund, both from a revenue and an expenditure perspective. Clearly, there have been a significant number and variability of impacts in our general fund directly related to COVID and the recent and the number of stay-at-home orders in particular. And then what I would like to do then is go into a rather sort of significant amount of detail in each of the major general fund taxes to really ensure that we all have a shared understanding of the tax revenue that comes in to the city of Santa Barbara and what it gets used for. So next slide, please. Jumping into the general fund. So this slide here shows two pie charts. The pie chart on the left shows for our fiscal year 21, our current fiscal year adopted, our revised budget, where do we get all of our revenue that comes into the general fund? And the pie chart on the right is how we spend it. So the first thing I'll point the council and the public to is that the pie chart on the left has many pieces of the pie, which is a really good thing. It is a diverse revenue base in the number of taxes that come into the general fund, as well as a number of departmental and other types of revenues that come in. The largest pieces of the pie include property tax, sales tax, and transient occupancy tax. Those are the largest pieces of our general fund revenue. And again, I'll go into quite some detail about each one of these in the coming slides. On the right-hand side, you'll see that more than half, approximately 53% of our general fund tax dollars go to pay for public safety, as I mentioned earlier. So those are the services of the city's police and fire departments. And you can see the other slices of the pie includes community services, such as library and parks and recreation, as well as community development, public works, and other governmental services. So next slide, please. I have a few slides here where I just want to provide a really high-level executive summary in regards to many of the recent trends and changes in our general fund. Again, approximately 2/3 of the city's general fund is made up from tax revenues. Those revenues can fluctuate, some of them rather significantly, based on various economic conditions. A little over 20 years ago, during the recession that occurred, both sales tax and transient occupancy tax declined fairly significantly. We saw that trend then. The city also experienced that decline of revenue during the Great Recession that occurred in fiscal year 2008, 2009, where both sales tax and TOD declined significantly again by a rather substantial amount. That created a one-year deficit during that year of approximately $10 million, requiring the use of reserves from then. Next slide, please. After the Great Recession, it took about 7 years for the city to be able to restore the service cuts and also replenish the reserves that were required to be dipped into to sustain operations. It took about 7 years. And so looking at where we are today, for the past year, we, along with every other city across the state and across the nation, have had many challenges directly related to COVID. We have experienced significant decline in our sales tax, our transient occupancy tax. We've also experienced a decline in other departmental revenues, including a reduced number of permits that are being issued by our community development department. We've had a reduction of library services, and we've also had to reduce or completely stop some of our parks and recreation programs. Many of those are funded through fees that we charge to our users. We've had to dip into our reserves in the current fiscal year, in fiscal year 21 adopted budget. And we've had to rethink how we deliver services to the public. Many of those examples are providing services electronically, where we would normally be able to serve the public in person. Next slide, please. So there still continues to be a rather high degree of uncertainty in the economy generally about how cities' general fund tax revenues will rebound and sort of re-baseline once the impacts of COVID have concluded. Some revenue sources have been impacted more substantially than others. I'll go into that. The city also continues to have pressure on the expenditure side. City pension costs continue to rise, and generally just providing services and materials and supplies costs more every year. So we've had to sort of adjust services and minimize the impact to the public based on those considerations. And we continue to look for ways of controlling costs and identifying efficiencies. Next slide, please. So now what I'd like to do is go into just sort of a high level overview of our revenues as sort of a comparative view before I jump into our major revenue sources. Next slide, please. So this slide here compares the city of Santa Barbara's general fund per capita. If you take our total general fund revenues and divide it by our population, you're able to sort of relatively compare any city with another. Again, it's challenging doing that because every city is a little bit different in what types of services are provided by that city and who they serve. But I was able to do that pulling public documents off of other cities' websites and comparing our fiscal year 21 budget against others. And as you can see, our per capita general fund is really similar to San Luis Obispo, a little bit more than some other cities that are close by, and a lot less compared to Santa Monica. But there are reasons why there is variability. First and foremost, for Santa Barbara, we're a full service city, which means we operate our own fire, our own police, our own enterprise functions like the water division. Many of these cities and other cities across the state don't. Also, Santa Barbara's daytime population swells. It grows by more than 30% on any given day. That number was I was able to get that sort of pre-COVID level. So in a normal sort of operating day-to-day year, there's a daytime population that requires city support and city services. There's also major tourism activities that occur here, and those tourists require city services as well. There's a major university, and also this is a place of major county operations where many of these cities don't have that. So again, those are just a couple of examples as to why it's challenging and also important when comparing budgets across different cities, just to provide some context. Next slide, please. Now I'd like to go into some detail regarding property tax. Next slide, please. Property tax is our largest revenue source in the general fund. It's administered by the county. The county administers property taxes for homeowners and commercial properties in the city limits. Property tax is heavily controlled by Proposition 13 that was passed in the late 70s, which basically placed a cap on the annual growth of property taxes in any given year. And it caps it at 2% or whatever the consumer price index assumption might be if it's less than 2%. And what the amount of money that gets paid for property tax is 1% of the assessed value. And I'll go through an example on the next slide about how that calculates. And there are a few exceptions in sort of changes that might occur on any particular property tax assessment, which I won't go into detail today, but it gets complicated depending on the type of property. Next slide, please. So there's a significant amount of property tax dollars that are generated on any given year across any county or across the state. So you might ask yourself, well, where does all that money go? So not all of it comes to the city of Santa Barbara, as I kind of alluded to earlier. The vast majority of property tax dollars go to fund public education throughout the state, across all levels of public education. That's about half of the pie. The next largest chunk funds county operations. And then the two smaller pieces of the pie fund city operations like ourselves. And then there are a number of special districts that operate on property tax being their primary funding source. Next slide, please. So let's take a really simple example of a home that has an assessed valuation of $1 million. So the amount of property tax that homeowner is going to pay on an annual basis is 1% of that $1 million. That equates to $10,000. And so what portion of that comes to the city of Santa Barbara? Well, according to that prior pie chart, it's 13%. So 13% of the $10,000 annual property tax payment, which is $1,300, that's what comes to the city of Santa Barbara. The rest of it goes to public education, the county, and so on and so forth. Next slide, please. This graph here shows the 10-year trend of property tax revenue that's come to the city of Santa Barbara. And as you can see, it's a fairly healthy trending upward graph in each of the years, but there is a little bit of variability in any given year, depending on the economic situation at the time. In the current fiscal year, the staff is projecting that we will achieve about 6% growth from the prior year. There has not been an immediate or a substantial impact on our property tax revenues directly related to COVID, and we'll talk more about that later. Next slide, please. So the next major revenue that comes through taxes in our general fund is sales tax. Next slide, please. So sales tax revenues for the city of Santa Barbara come through two primary mechanisms. The first is what's called Bradley-Burns, and that's your typical sales and use tax on any sort of retail sale transaction that occurs in the city. It's administered by the state of California. Sales tax that's collected at a store you might buy something from, that store sends that money to the state of California, and the state of California distributes that money to all of the municipalities throughout the state that are required to receive it. The statewide rate that comes to the city is 1%. That's what comes to the city of Santa Barbara on any given sale. The current sales tax rate in Santa Barbara is 8.75%. So the other piece of sales tax that comes to us is our Measure C district sales tax that the voters approved back in 2017. And this is a general purpose district sales tax, and that's a 1% additional sales tax rate that has gone to fund a number of critical capital improvement projects and will continue to do so. So the total tax rate that comes to the city of Santa Barbara is 2%. It's the 1% from Bradley-Burns plus the 1% of our Measure C equaling 2%. Next slide, please. So not surprisingly, sales tax has been hit substantially due to the impacts of COVID. There also was a pretty major shift in sales tax activity because of much of the economy moving to more service-based, which is not taxable. And also the shift in consumer spending with sort of the move away from the more traditional brick and mortar activity, going to a sort of a mall like La Cumbre Mall, and shopping in a mall, and moving more towards online retail. Next slide, please. So online retail generates a significant portion of sales tax revenue for the city of Santa Barbara. And there was a recent court order at the Supreme Court that ensures that cities are adequately receiving the amount of sales tax that they should be getting on online sales activity. That was sort of a very new phenomenon where many cities weren't receiving it. That has since been corrected through this Wayfair versus South Dakota decision that occurred fairly recently. Next slide, please. So this graphic here shows on a given purchase, let's say I go to the beach house and buy a $75 boogie board for my son, right? I pay 8.75% of tax on that boogie board, and that equates to $6.56. And you can see what the total receipt is here. On the right-hand side, it shows the breakdown of how much money of that $6.56 comes to the city of Santa Barbara. You see it's around 22% comes to the city. The rest of it goes primarily to the state of California. The sales tax is, I believe, the largest revenue for the state of California. And then there's other districts and county funding that go from sales tax. Next slide, please. This slide here shows the quarter over quarter change of sales tax trends by major industry in the city of Santa Barbara. So for example, the red line here shows general retail activity. That's your typical retail activity that might occur on State Street. You can see that quarter over quarter, especially during the past 3 quarters during COVID, it has been down. We've seen a significant decline in sales tax activity for most of the industries that operate here in Santa Barbara. And this is a very typical trend that many cities have seen, not just us. The one thing I want to point out to you on this graph in the line that's green here, that green line represents primarily sales tax that comes from online retail. So if you were to buy something on Amazon, you can see that there's a substantial amount of growth in online retail sales tax activity. Again, with changing purchasing behaviors, we've seen this. And again, this is a typical change that many cities are seeing with the change of their sales tax activities. Next slide, please. This graph here shows the change of our sales tax here at the city of Santa Barbara compared to the entire Santa Barbara County, and then also compared to the state. And the city of Santa Barbara is the sort of light blue line. And this is important to distinguish because during the past 3 quarters of COVID, you can see that Santa Barbara's sales tax was hit more substantially compared to both the county at large and also statewide. We have a significantly greater amount of sort of retail activity here in Santa Barbara. So our sales tax for retail in particular was hit harder compared to the county and the state. Next slide, please. So given all that, this slide here shows the 10-year trend of our sales tax rates. And you can see here in the past few years, it was sort of holding steady. And then in 2019, we saw a sort of an influx, a large increase, primarily due to that court decision with ensuring that online retail sales tax activity was going and distributed to the right jurisdictions. You can see here, though, that in the current fiscal year, we're projecting a 3% decline from last fiscal year, and in total a 13% decline from fiscal year 2019. So a substantial decline, again, primarily related to COVID. Next slide, please. So the next tax revenue that I want to go into some detail on is our transient occupancy tax. It's also commonly referred to as the hotel tax or the bed tax. Next slide, please. So Santa Barbara is a tourist destination. It's no surprise to any of you, probably. There are more than 60 hotels that operate here in Santa Barbara. And lodging guests use city services. And so this is a tax on the transient. It's on the person that stays in a hotel room. It's a tax on that person so that they can receive city services. The tax is paid by the guest and it's remitted from the hotel to the city, typically on a monthly basis. The revenue really is a function of the room rate and the level of occupancy at any given hotel. The current TOT rate in Santa Barbara is 12%. 10% of that comes to the general fund. It's the vast majority of it. The remaining 2% is a restricted revenue that goes to fund creeks restoration and water quality improvement projects. Next slide, please. Again, it should be no surprise that the TOT revenue has been substantially impacted due to COVID. Many hotels were forced to close temporarily. They saw a dramatic decline in occupancy, which is indicated here on this graph on the right-hand side. It also showed that there was a dramatic decline and a high degree of variability in the average daily rate. And there's a direct correlation between sort of the average daily rate dropping and rising and the hotel occupancy during the past year during COVID. And staff at this time does anticipate a fairly quick rebound of hotel activity here starting in the spring into the summer months. Next slide, please. This graph here shows the 10-year trend, similar to sales and property taxes. It showed a fairly stable growth in our TOT revenue over the past 8 or 9 years. And then immediately following COVID, we saw a decline in revenue in 2020. And then in 2021, we're projecting a 4% decline from last year and overall a 26% decline from fiscal year 2019. Next slide, please. The next largest tax revenue for our general fund is what's called our utility users tax, or it's called UUT as well. Next slide, please. So a utility users tax is a tax that is levied on residential and commercial services, such as water and garbage and electricity and phone and cable. It's also a tax that is levied on telecommunications as well. And Measure G was passed in November of 2019 to support that effort to ensure that there's adequate and dedicated funding for streets projects using UUT. Next slide, please. Back in 2008, the city was able to modernize its UUT ordinance and adjust for the ever-changing trends in the telecommunications industry. And so there's also a recent activity going on in UUT management for digital service providers, the likes of Netflix or Hulu or Disney Plus, and really going through the process to see if those types of services are in effect taxable. Next slide, please. This graph here on the left shows our UUT revenue trends over the past 10 years. It's fairly flat. There is not a lot of variability in the number of people that use these utilities and the tax that the city receives from it. The pie chart on the right shows the different portions of the UUT revenue where we generate our revenue from. Primarily here in the city of Santa Barbara, it comes from water, electricity, refuse, and gas and phone. Next slide, please. Now I'd like to provide just a really brief overview of our cannabis tax. Next slide, please. So back in 2016, city voters approved Measure D, which imposed a tax on cannabis businesses here in Santa Barbara, up to 20%. The city recently adopted regulations and completed an initial permitting process. And as of today, I believe there's 12 licensed cannabis businesses here in Santa Barbara. Next slide, please. So the tax rates that are actually charged based on gross receipts depend on the type of activity. So the rate may vary if it's a storefront cannabis retail operation, or if it's a manufacturing or distribution center, or if they're doing indoor cultivation. So there's different rates depending on the type of business that might be in operation. This is a very young industry here in Santa Barbara, and it has a potential area of significant growth. And you can see here, since businesses began to operate in Santa Barbara, the revenue that we saw from the tax revenue has grown fairly substantially. We're projecting a substantial amount of growth in 2021, but it will likely level off, and we'll see some flattening of that revenue in the upcoming fiscal year. Next slide, please. So now I'd like to talk about our business license tax program. Next slide, please. So if you conduct business in the city, you must obtain a business license. And as of right now, there are approximately 16,000 registered businesses that have an active business license to operate here in the city of Santa Barbara. There is an annual renewal requirement. You can see what the application looks like here on the right-hand side. For small businesses, those that might generate anywhere under $1 million of gross receipts on a given year, the amount of the business license tax is around $300, depending on the type. So it's not a substantial amount of tax for any one individual business. Next slide, please. This graph here shows the 10-year trend of our business license tax revenue. As you can see, it's been fairly flat. We are projecting a decline in fiscal year 2021. Again, our business license tax it's retrospective, so it's reported on prior years' gross receipts. And we know that many of the businesses in Santa Barbara have struggled due to COVID. Some of them have closed. And so we do anticipate a decline in the city's business license tax that corresponds directly to that decline in activity. Next slide, please. There are many other different types of smaller revenues that come into the general fund. That ranges from a real property transfer tax. There are police fines. We're able to earn interest on the cash that we're able to invest. That comes in as revenue. There are late fees, fire inspections, so on and so forth. I won't go into any detail on any of these, but there are a few other revenues that come in that I just wanted council to be aware of. Next slide, please. So that sort of concludes the general fund revenue slides. Staff would be happy to take any questions, Madam Mayor, at this time if you want, or I can proceed and move on to the expenditure slides if you'd like.
Very good. Ms. Sneddon, questions?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I just have a couple. I think you mentioned pension impacts, I guess, a while back there. And if maybe you could talk about unfunded liability and just what our pension impacts are. I know it's not a small question, but if you could frame that for us.
Councilmember Sneddon, I'd be happy to. And that's actually the next section that I'll be covering.
Oh,
on my slides.
that's
So if
fine.
you
It
don't
can
mind,
wait.
Yeah.
That can wait. Yeah, I knew it wasn't. I knew it couldn't be that small.
No
And
problem.
then for the general fund per capita, and you had like the different reasons why our city was different, and then it said major county operations. And could you explain which way does that impact it? Is it, do we have imposed county operations that we have to pay for, or ones we've chosen, or what did that mean? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, Councilmember Sneddon, I'm glad you asked. I'm sorry if that was confusing. So just to clarify, the reason why I included that on the slide was because it goes to the point of the daytime population here in the city growing to approximately 30% on average. And so we know that there are major county operations that are sort of housed here, county office buildings. There's people that commute into the city. Those people require city services. They may go out to lunch. I mean, there's different activities that occur because of some of the unique operations like the county, like UCSB, things like that.
Okay, thank you. That clarifies. So it's the county personnel and not like a county program like trash management or
Correct.
Okay, thank you. And then you mentioned the changes with the Wayfair versus South Dakota and the online. Are we starting to see the impacts of that and like the increase in the tax revenue we're getting, and by how much? Like how much difference has it made? Or like by a dollar amount, how much do we expect that might matter?
Yeah, Councilmember Sneddon, that's a great question. And so the answer to that question is yes. We have been able to, as a city, receive what is due to us from the impacts of the Wayfair decision for online retail activity. And we first started seeing some of that additional revenue a few years back. I would say that it's not a significant amount of revenue, additional revenue that we would be receiving from that. It's not significant. So, yeah.
So then compared to the shift towards service type economy versus a retail type, is it not as much an impact with the sort of Amazon effect as much as it is just the type of industry?
Yeah, so service industries, like professional services or other types of services they're not taxable. You cannot charge a sales tax rate on a service. You must charge a sales tax or a use tax on the purchase of a good, like a retail type activity, and online retail. So those types of purchases are taxable. And so the Wayfair decision really solidified and ensured that cities where the actual point of sale occurred, that city actually receives its fair share of sales tax revenue. So that's sort of the distinction with the Wayfair decision.
And then just one more quick question. How does that impact cannabis? Are some of those service and some are retail, or is it all the same, our tax on that? Just that's my last question there. Yeah.
Sure. So the cannabis tax is a separate tax on cannabis businesses here in Santa Barbara. So if you were to buy a product at a cannabis retail establishment, you would pay sales tax. You as the user would go in and pay the sales tax associated with that purchase. But then that cannabis retail establishment then also has to remit a cannabis tax to the city. So the sales tax is different than the cannabis tax.
And then mobile sales, how does that, if it's being delivered in a van from somewhere else, I don't know why I said a van, delivered from somewhere else, does that tax go to Santa Barbara, or does it go to where it originated from?
Councilmember Senn, so I would have to go back and confirm that, but the person that's ordering for a mobile delivery for cannabis I believe would pay the sales tax because they're purchasing a product. I don't believe the service component of that is taxable. Again, I would have to go and just really make sure that I analyze that and get you a complete answer.
Thank you. It was a minor question. Thank you so much. Excellent presentation so far. Thank you.
Thanks. Mayor Pro Tem Oscar Gutierrez and then Councilmember Friedman.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you for the presentation. To piggyback off of what Councilmember Sneddon was asking about the cannabis tax, is there a difference between the recreational cannabis and the medicinal cannabis when it comes to taxing them?
Mr. Martini, can I let Mayor Pro Tem Gutierrez know that we can't see your face? Did you want to try to turn on your webcam because we saw you during the roll call?
I can see myself on mine. I'm not sure what's happening. I'm using an old computer, but I can see myself on my screen.
We hear you just fine, so go ahead. Mr. Martini, thank you.
Sure. Councilmember Gutierrez, thank you for that question. No, I don't believe that there is a distinction on whether it's for medicinal purposes or recreational, the amount of tax that the user would pay as far as sales tax, or the amount of cannabis tax that the establishment would have to remit to the city. But I see City Attorney chiming in here. I'm happy to have him help me out with this question.
Thank you.
Just to add that the taxing ordinance that was approved by the voters allows the council to set different rates for medical or recreational.
Oh, so are they the same now, or you're saying we have the ability to make them different?
I didn't address whether we have it now because I don't remember, honestly, but you do have the authority to make them different.
Interesting. Okay. My second question is, when you were talking about how much the cable companies get taxed, does that include internet service? And is it different from the cellular taxing?
Yes, Councilmember Gutierrez. Yeah, so internet, I believe, is tax, and I believe that it's different than cellular. I think on the graph that I presented, it was rolled up under a different category. Yeah, so those utilities are taxed, and so the user of that utility pays the city's UUT tax when they pay their monthly bill to the utility company, and then that utility company will then remit the UUT to the city of Santa Barbara, like on a monthly basis. So that's kind of how that works.
Okay. All right, those are my questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Gutierrez. Mr. Friedman?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you, Mr. DiMartini. Great first round of budget. So glad to have you here. A few questions. I'm going to start with property tax trends. It says projecting a 6% growth. But I wanted to speak specifically to the issue. I think it's a supplemental property tax where it comes in, and that's slightly different. And is that increasing or decreasing?
So I believe Councilmember Friedman, thank you for that question. I believe what you might be referring to is when, like, for example, when a property might change hands and it might get reassessed, there's a time lag from when the county is able to conduct that reassessment to when the owner, receives that and then is then paying the 1% property tax on the reassessed value. And so there is a timing delay there. The projection that we currently have for fiscal year 21 includes any of those reassessments that might occur. So the city will receive sort of a baseline, the largest portion based on, most properties in Santa Barbara not changing hands. So that's fairly, straightforward and easier to project. It's the amount of sort of reassessments that might occur when a property changes hands. And we do have some recent data that helps us understand that trend that I'll be sharing with you a little bit later in this presentation.
Okay, thank you. And just for the public, property tax is a little different because it's done a year out. So any impacts of COVID or whatever, they would be a year delay rather than transient occupancy tax and sales tax where they're felt pretty much within a month or so.
Mr.
Strong.
Colon?
Madam Mayor, if I might, I can quickly complete the answer to Mayor Pro Tem Gutierrez. That in March of 2018, the council set the maximum tax rate at 6% for storefront retail, did not distinguish medical. The voter approved initiative allows tax rates of up to 20% on cannabis.
Okay, good. We got your answer, Mr. Gutierrez. You done, Mr. Friedman?
Just a couple more questions.
Oh, please, yeah, go ahead.
On the transient occupancy tax, you know that it's noted that we anticipate a fairly quick rebound in the spring. What one is, with all that's going on, I'm sure that there's data that went into that, but what are the plans if we don't have that quick rebound? Do you have other projections that you have, like a plan B?
Thank you, Councilmember Friedman, for that question. So, staff is continually monitoring the activity going on with the hotels here in Santa Barbara. So we receive weekly reports from Visit Santa Barbara on occupancy and average nightly rate information. We also are up to date and up to speed on various economic forecast meetings that occur both at UCLA and at UCSB. So we are monitoring the activities very carefully. So our projections are in line with the best projections that are out there at this time. And so plan B will be to continue to monitor it. And if we see that there continues to be declines or other changes in TOT activity, we will have that conversation with Finance Committee and with the City Council about potentially, what other revenues we might have to draw from, or if there's a need to continue to leverage reserves. But I think that's a larger conversation that we'll have with you at a later time.
And Madam Mayor, yeah, thank you, Madam Mayor and Councilmember Friedman. I agree with Mr. DiMartini on that. We have to remain nimble. The one thing about the bed tax is that is the most immediate information that we get out of all the major tax sources. Sales tax lags by 3 months, property taxes, kind of estimated with the county. So we keep a close eye on the bed tax. We did a pretty darn good job back in April, May, June, estimating what revenues we're going to do with a lot of uncertainty. But then we had the closure again here in December and January, so that wasn't planned for. And I just want to say on the bed tax, when we say we expect a recovery, we expect it to get better. We don't expect it to be right back to where it was pre-COVID. We're still expecting a kind of a recession era type recovery. But we do think as the vaccines roll out and everything you're hearing that domestic travel is going to start increasing.
Thank you, very helpful. One last question. Thank you, Mr. Case. That answers the questions. And last question I had around cannabis, and maybe you answered it. I couldn't recall, but the reason that the revenues are going up is now we have the third retailer online. Is that the reason for the growth that we're seeing in that chart that you showed?
Yeah, Councilmember Freeman, I think the main reasons for the sort of exponential growth that we've seen over the past year or two is a function of it's a very young industry here in Santa Barbara, so there are new businesses that open up each year that have been opening up. We are not aware of any additional businesses, I think at this time that are planning to. I don't have that information available, so I'm not sure about the continued exponential growth. It's also just a combination of, I think there might be some trends. There might have been some trends with COVID, with the stay-at-home orders, with potential increased recreational use, as well as just those businesses continuing to mature and continuing to grow. And so it's sort of the tax revenue as a combination of all of those factors, I believe.
Okay, thank you very much.
Any other questions? Well, Mr. DeMartini, I did look at last year's budget message. There were some predictions related to pandemic, and one of them was about the utility users tax, that it was an unknown what it meant that more people were staying home and working from home. And I see that it's a 2% growth projection. So, I mean, if we're coming out of pandemic with vaccinations, maybe it's, we don't really need to tease it out. But if people will be working at home more, I wonder, did you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's a great question, Madam Mayor. And we did talk to our sort of UT auditors and consultants about that very phenomenon. And I think that was an assumption that was made sort of early on with COVID and stay-at-home orders, that there might be a substantial increase of UT tax because of that. We're not seeing it. I'm not sure that many other cities are truly seeing it. So it's not coming to fruition. It's not becoming an additional large chunk of revenue for the city, unfortunately.
Okay, well, let's see, what's next? And you answered all my questions about cannabis. Okay, we're going into expenditures.
Okay, thank you so much, Madam Mayor. Okay, so next slide, please. So now that I've talked in quite some detail about our general fund revenues, now I'd like to shift gears and talk about our expenditures. So what do we use these variable general fund revenues for? What services are we able to provide to the public? And so this slide here summarizes where those general fund tax and other revenue dollars go to. The vast majority of them, as I said earlier, approximately 53% of the city's general fund expenditures go to pay for public safety. That's staff primarily in the fire department and the police department. You can see that the other slices of the pie here go to pay for community services like parks and recreation and library and such. About 80%, a little less than 80% of the general fund tax dollars and other revenues pay for staff. It pays for the people that provide services to the public. It's the salaries that the staff make and other benefits that they might receive and the benefit costs. The other types of expenditures that are using general fund tax dollars and such include materials and supplies, other types of services, allocated costs, and it also includes capital. We do use some general fund dollars to pay for some capital improvements throughout the city. Next slide, please. So again, the most substantial portion of the general fund expenditures are for salaries and benefits. So I want to spend the bulk of these next 5 or 6 slides talking about that, and primarily to get to Councilmember Sneddon's questions about the city's pension costs. I do have a number of slides where I'll talk about the implications of our pension system. So first, salary and benefits. So salaries pay for both full-time and hourly employees. It also, in our projections, it will include any step increases or any cost of living adjustments that might occur in our negotiated union contracts. It could also pay for overtime. We've had some overtime expenses, primarily with the fire department for some of our mutual aid activities in neighboring communities. That fortunately is recovered through revenue that we get for that mutual aid activity. So there is quite a bit of overtime that is directly recoverable through mutual aid. And then there are other benefits that we pay for our staff: medical premiums and insurance, workers' compensation, unemployment insurance. And then the largest benefit is pension, which I want to go to in quite some detail. So next slide, please. So Santa Barbara is a member of the CalPERS system. And it's rather complex about sort of the different components of the CalPERS, our pension expenses in a given year. So I would like to break it down in a couple different slides to hopefully achieve a shared understanding of the implications of our participation in the CalPERS system and what the impacts have been over the past few years and what they are projected to be. So first, I want to define and describe what the normal cost is. So the normal cost to the city of participating in the CalPERS system is actually two components. It's what we submit to CalPERS every time we process payroll, every 2 weeks. And those two components are a portion that the city pays and the other portion that the employee pays. So both components are processed through payroll, and we remit that to CalPERS. And what that calculation is based on a very complex actuarial study that is conducted every year by CalPERS that tells us what those rates should be. And typically for most employees for the city, it's anywhere between 10 to 12% of their salary. And for the public safety employees, it's a little bit more. It's between 20 to 22% for the safety employees. Next slide, please. The next major component of the city's cost and the burden on the city for the pension system is what's called an unfunded liability. It's also called an unfunded actuarial liability, or a UAL. And so you might ask yourself, well, what creates an unfunded liability, and really what is that? Well, there are a number of reasons how an unfunded liability can occur. And this slide here lists the 4 primary reasons for how that can occur. First, CalPERS invests the money that they receive. They have a significant investment portfolio, and they invest their money in a variety of different investment mechanisms, including real estate and other investments. And they assume an annual rate of return of 7%. If they don't achieve their annual rate of return of 7%, it creates an unfunded liability. And it is the responsibility of the plan participants, like the city of Santa Barbara, to make up that difference. And that's a phenomenon that has occurred in recent years. And I have a graph that sort of shows the impacts to the city on that. What also might cause an unfunded liability are enhancements to staff salaries increases. It also might be any number of benefit enhancements, which might provide some additional burden on the pension requirement. And then also, people are living longer. And so the rates that we pay and the amount that we pay to CalPERS, it's all based on actuarial assumptions. And the primary driver of that is how long people will live. Well, people are living longer. And so they're needing to adjust their actuarial assumptions. And so people are drawing down on their pension benefits for a much longer period of time. That creates an additional liability on the city that will have to be paid over time as CalPERS adjusts those assumptions. The table on the right-hand side summarizes the amount of the unfunded liability for all of the miscellaneous employees, which is the majority of the workforce, and for police and for fire. And it shows what percent funded we currently are. And as you can see, we range anywhere from 62% to 71%. And that had been declining down to those rates in recent years. I will say that this is a trend, and this is a position that many cities across the state of California are in. We are not unique in this situation, and we have things that we can do, and we have as a city have already done some things to minimize the impact and the cost on the city due to these pretty extraordinary high costs. And I'll go into those in a little bit more detail in the coming slides. Next slide, please. So when you talk about our pension costs in totality, it's a combination of the normal cost that the city remits to CalPERS on every payroll that we process, and it's also our annual portion of the unfunded actuarial liability. Those two components make up the total pension cost for the city. And there are some distinctions depending on whether you're a classic member or There was pension reform that occurred a number of years ago. There are many employees that have been hired since then that pay a higher normal cost than some of the classic members. Those are PEPRA employees. So there is some distinction and some nuance that are important to note for pension costs going forward. Next slide, please. I mentioned on a prior slide that one of the primary driving factors for the unfunded actuarial liability for our pension costs is whether or not CalPERS is able to achieve the 7% assumed rate of return. This graph here shows what the historical rate of return has been for CalPERS investments on an annual basis over the past close to 30 years. And you can see here that there has been a significant amount of variability in returns. And it ties pretty closely to economic recessions that have occurred throughout that time. The red line across the middle there shows sort of the trend, the average, and it's around the 7%. So if you were to average those numbers, you can see that it's around 7%. But again, there's a high degree of variability, which will cause fluctuations in the actuarial liability that we have to pay as a city. Next slide, please. This slide here shows what the total city pension costs have been for us over the past 8 years. And as you can see, for the past 4 or 5 years prior to where we are now, it hovered between the $20 to $25 million range. But as you can see, over the past 4 years, it has been sort of exponentially showing growth. And that growth is expected to continue for the next 4 or 5 fiscal years as we continue to make substantial payments towards our unfunded actuarial liability to where we finally, hopefully, start seeing some relief. But again, those are assumptions that are based on actuarial studies. Clearly, COVID-19 is going to have an impact on CalPERS investments, probably. And so we will have to monitor that very closely over time to see what additional impacts there may or may not be. Next slide, please. So I mentioned earlier that we have options. The city has options to consider. And the city has already implemented a really strategic option. And instead of paying every payroll or every month a portion of our unfunded actuarial liability, the city has chosen to make an upfront payment in July every year. Well, we've been able to save a couple $100,000 every single year by doing that. So we've already been able to implement that strategy. This slide here lists a number of other strategies that many cities have employed in recent years to help minimize and manage their pension costs throughout the years. That includes potential employee cost sharing, the employer contribution. It also includes controlling rates of pay for employees above and beyond the minimum annual requirement. Cities have been able to do that. Cities have set up pre-funding programs. And some cities have also issued pension obligation bonds. They've actually bonded against that liability to pay it off and then pay a set bond rate for a duration of time. So it looks like Mayor Murillo, I see you come on. I'm happy to take any questions from you or other council members, please.
Well, I had one, and of course, this is a subject that other council members might have questions on before you go to the next section. So the CalPERS investment problems started with the Great Recession. Isn't that correct? You referred to it, in another part of the presentation, but just sometimes people will have concern about us giving our employees too much pension benefit, and really it bears explaining that it was the the stock market crash and the housing lending bubble and practices by the banking industry that led into that. If you would just give us a little bit of that information so that we know how we got to this place, because I'm not sure you covered that.
Sure. Madam Mayor, thank you so much for the question. So on one of the graphs, a few graphs before this, I showed that trend of the CalPERS investment rate of return. And you are correct. During the Great Recession of 08-09, their rate of return dropped down to, I believe it was negative 25%, right? So they were losing a substantial amount of their investment portfolio during that time. You could see on that graph also, there was a significant decline in their investment returns back in 2001, 2002, during another recession that occurred in the economy at that time. And CalPERS has a significant investment portfolio and an investment strategy. They invest very heavily in real estate and many, many other instruments that are all subject to the economy and the strength of the economy or the weaknesses thereof. So when CalPERS is unable to achieve their target 7% rate of return, then they're not able to achieve it, in which case it creates that additional liability.
Right, I was making the point, thank you, that it was not the fault of our employees that there was that huge dip. But we're all trying to deal with it and backfill and come out of it. So any other questions on the pension question before we go to general fund capital, I think is your next section?
Yes.
And we'll go another half an hour and then take a break. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Madam Mayor. Okay, I'll keep going. All right, the next section I'd like to cover is our general fund capital. So general fund has been able to make investments in the city's capital infrastructure over the years, and Measure C has been a really amazing addition to allow the city to continue to do that. And so I have a few slides to present on general fund capital. Next slide, please. So historically, the city has been able to allocate anywhere between $1 to $2 million on any given year for capital investment. That ranges from investments in the city's playgrounds, restrooms, information technology improvements throughout the city, and so on and so forth. A majority of capital projects that occur throughout the city aren't funded by the general fund, however. They're primarily funded through the enterprises, like the water enterprise, the wastewater enterprise, so on and so forth. The city has also been very successful in achieving some really strategic grants in recent years, both from Measure A. We also receive a healthy portion of gas tax revenue that helps fund strategic paving and street infrastructure type projects. And I mentioned the 50% of the UUT that comes to the streets fund, as well as a portion of the TOT revenue goes to pay for creeks and water projects as well. Next slide, please. So back in 2017, as I mentioned earlier, the voters approved Measure C, which was a 1% sales tax rate increase. It's a general purpose, general fund tax revenue source. And per the direction from the city council, staff have been able to implement and make progress on a number of critical infrastructure and capital projects, using that as a primary funding source to be able to deliver. The city expects to receive anywhere between around $22 million in fiscal year 2021 from the Measure C district sales tax alone. It was a major win for the community to provide a dedicated, a stable, fairly stable funding source in the long term for capital investments. I will say that there's still a need. So even though it's a significant portion of funding to make progress, there still is a backlog of deferred maintenance and other capital projects that are seeking funding. Next slide, please. So this slide here just summarizes the priorities that were articulated in the ballot measure itself back in 2017, describing how that money was to be used. And then the city council adopted a resolution that describes the priorities for that funding over the next 5 years. That includes planning for and constructing the new police station facility, repairing streets, replacing fire station number 7, other community projects, supporting businesses, and maintenance of city buildings. Next slide, please. So this slide here summarizes the actual revenue that has come into the city since the passage of Measure C back in 2017. As I mentioned earlier during the sales tax slides, we have seen a decline in our Measure C revenue in fiscal year 20 and fiscal year 21. There's a great deal of economic uncertainty, and we are anticipating sort of a very slow and steady recovery starting in fiscal year 22 and thereafter. And I'll get into more information on that in the multi-year forecast section of today's presentation. Next slide, please. So this slide here summarizes in fiscal year 20, so last fiscal year, the actual project expenditures for those critical capital projects funded through Measure C. And as you can see, Measure C has been used to pay for a number of street improvement projects. It was used to help complete the Cabrillo Pavilion, a number of the initial planning and design work for the new police facility, and a number of other infrastructure and capital projects. Next slide, please. Okay, so now that I presented an overview of our general fund revenues, and I've also gone into quite some detail about how much and the trends in our general fund expenditures, including capital. When you do the math, you then figure out how much might be left over, or if we're running a deficit, what impacts that might be on our reserves. So now I'd like to shift gears and talk about our reserves. Next slide, please. So this slide here summarizes the reserves in the general fund over the past 15 plus years. And I mentioned earlier that during the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009, the city made the decision to go ahead and tap into those reserves in order to help balance the budget and to minimize the impact on operations during that year. And you can see here on this graph in 2008, there was the city made the decision to go ahead and tap into those reserves. And I also mentioned earlier that it took around 7 years to make slow and steady progress as the economy recovered, as our general fund tax revenues rebounded. It took about 7 years to chip away and start replenishing those reserves until we were able to meet the city council reserve targets of 25% of our annual operating expenditures. And as you can see, starting in fiscal year 20 and what's being projected in fiscal year 21, that graph looks fairly similar to what we experienced back in 2008 and 2009, where again, I'm very thankful that the city has been able to prioritize and maintain a really strong and adequate reserve level, because this is the time where we need to be able to dip in those reserves in times like today, like this past year. So we are doing a great deal of modeling, and we'll be happy to have this conversation in a lot of detail with first the Finance Committee and again with the City Council during the budget meetings about implications on the city's reserves as we move out of COVID and the impacts from it into sort of what the new normal looks like. Next slide, please. I mentioned earlier that the City Council sets the reserve policy for the city. It's 25% of our annual operating expenditures. And I mentioned, sort of described already what the trends have been on the reserves over the past few years. Okay, next slide, please. So Madam Mayor, if it's okay with you, I'll keep going into the next section, if that's okay, where I'll talk about the multi-year forecast.
Sure. I mean, one of my questions that I had in general on my list was, how will we replenish the reserves after the pandemic downturn? Is that what you're calling it, a downturn? It's not exactly a recession, but you know, the situation that we find ourselves in. But if that's a discussion that you'll start with the Finance Committee, that makes sense to me. I'm sure this is your job. You have ideas how to fill the piggy bank back up when we're able. So that was, Mr. Casey, that was just one of the things I was going to bring up at some point.
Yeah, Madam Mayor, I'll just chime in on that if you don't mind. Absolutely right question. You know, we actually have a resolution about the use of reserves, and included in that is to come up with a plan and program to replenish the reserves. We haven't done that yet because we're in the midst of a once a century, pandemic, economic, just unforeseen. But you're right, as things settle down, we will need to come up with a thoughtful plan to do it. And it's going to take discipline. It could take discipline on if we get federal relief monies. You know, there's talk again about a stimulus bill that might provide local governments with some assistance. And if we get some, we'll come to the council and talk about what are our priorities about how to use that money. And I think part of that discussion will be to help plenish our reserves. Otherwise, it's just fiscal discipline year in, year out to build it up. And it takes time, as Mr. DiMartini showed. So great question. We will be engaging you all with more conversations about that.
Thanks. Well, let's keep going. We have another 20 minutes before our break. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Madam Mayor. So we'll go into the next section and sort of the last major section of my portion of the presentation today, which is sort of the looking forward. I spent most of today talking about sort of the baseline, making sure that we have shared understanding about the city's budget and our financial structures, provide an overview of the enterprises, the general fund, and sort of historical trends for those general fund tax revenues in particular. So now I'd like to spend this last portion on the go forward, on what is expected and anticipated. And I will say that staff have been hard at work for a number of months now at really trying to understand the different factors that in the economy that impact our revenues and expenditures. And we've been doing a lot of listening and a lot of reading and a lot of conferring and a lot of talking about that. And all of that goes into this multi-year forecast process, which is the very, very beginning part of our annual budget cycle, which really helps staff and conveys to the city council and to the public about sort of the long-term view of our financial situation so that we can make the best informed decisions. So I'm going to talk about, next slide, please, sort of the multi-year forecast process and what we do and what goes into it and what's the current result of it as of right now. Again, we take a multi-year approach. We're going to be here for more than a year out. So it's important and it's best practice and good government that we look beyond the next year and we look out multiple years, even beyond 5 years in some cases. It'll help us at the staff level to identify any structural imbalances in our budget that exist beyond a year that we may not see if we're only looking at 1 year out. We're able to anticipate and identify challenges in that forecast period and start strategizing and coming up with ways that we can address those issues now so that we can really be at the forefront and make better decisions. Next slide, please. So next, I'm going to go through a few slides here, a few graphs about some key economic indicators that have really helped inform our multi-year forecasting process. So this first graph here is a graph of US gross domestic product, the GDP. And this graph here is just for certain industries that are pretty strong here in Santa Barbara. It's healthcare, restaurants, recreation, and travel. Those are some really strong, sort of high number of employees, a lot of business activity here in Santa Barbara. And as you can see, COVID had a significant drop of GDP activity. And then it sort of rebounded a little bit, but there's slow and steady growth being projected in 2021 and not really returning to sort of pre-COVID GDP levels until 2023. So it sort of assumes a slow and steady gradual growth of GDP over the next few years. Next slide, please. This graph here shows GDP again, but for more sort of good-based industries. So for businesses that sell recreational goods or household goods or electronics, you can see those industries really thrived during COVID because people were home, people were buying things for their house, online retail activity. The dynamic of retail activity sort of changed during that time. You can see there's a little bit of drop, but not going down to where it was pre-COVID, continuing to gradually grow. Those are industries that are strong here in Santa Barbara, but not as strong as some of the service-based industry. Next slide, please. This graph here shows a 100-year trend of the US unemployment rate. So it shows, I wanted to show this graph because it shows sort of the 4 very large economic events that occurred during that 100-year period where there was a substantial increase of unemployment activity. You can see that the Great Depression, about a quarter of the workforce had some form of unemployment. You can see the unemployment that occurred during the financial crisis back in 2008 that we've talked about a couple times today. Well, you can see in the United States, COVID had a significant impact on unemployment at over 14%. So much higher than what was experienced during the during the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. Next slide, please. This slide here is sort of an interesting graphic of the major employment industries here in Santa Barbara. And so there's a key couple takeaways I'd like the council and the public to get on this slide. First, the boxes on the left are the largest ones. We have a really strong healthcare and sort of professional workforce and educational service workforce here in Santa Barbara, which has shown to be fairly stable during COVID. You know, some variation, but fairly stable. The boxes in the middle, where we're talking about accommodation for travel and hotel and food service and retail, those are really large portions of our economy here in Santa Barbara as well, and those were hit the hardest. So there was a sales tax graph I showed earlier that showed Santa Barbara sales tax trends were hit harder than the county at large and the state. And this is another take on that because we have such a significant portion of our economy that relies on the accommodation, food, and retail industries. Next slide, please. This graph here shows travel spending throughout California over the past 2 years, and then the projection into the next few fiscal years. Again, you can see that the travel industry declined by more than half, by more than 50% from 2019 into 2020. And it's showing some gradual growth thereafter, but not returning to the pre-COVID spending activity until 2024. So again, there's a number of years where economists are projecting sort of a slow and steady gradual recovery for just general spending in relation to travel. Next slide, please. This graph here talks about property tax. It's sort of Councilmember Freeman's comments earlier. Property tax has not experienced any decline in projections as of late. And even though there's a lag on sort of the property tax assessments that occur, there is really no indication that property tax revenues will be declining in the coming years. And in fact, the projections are that they'll be continuing to grow. And this graph sort of summarizes those trends in two kind of key points here. The graph on the left shows the median sales price for the greater Santa Barbara area continuing to grow over the past years. And in 2020, it was a record year. The median sales price was just above $1.5 million. And the number of sales actually grew as well. So the volume of transactions are growing and the median sales price is growing. So that will have a positive impact on property tax dollars. The table on the right shows some key indicators that I think are worth noting. The median sales price was up 20% year over year. The volume increased about 30%, but the inventory on the market was only up about 5%. So there's still additional demand out there for people interested in purchasing real estate. So that again bodes well for a strong property tax projection in the coming year. Next slide, please. So putting all that together, this slide and the next summarize some of the major highlights and the major assumptions built into the city's multi-year forecast. We know that there was a significant impact on sales tax and transient occupancy tax in particular. We know there was an impact on our parks and recreation fees and our building permit fees. We know that we're coming in a little bit under budget in fiscal year 21. So in looking at fiscal year 22, we're projecting strong property tax growth to continue to occur. For sales tax, we are projecting growth in fiscal year 22, but again, we're projecting the sort of that slow and steady growth that was pretty well indicated on those economic indicator graphs. We are projecting a rebound of our TOT revenue, as the city administrator mentioned earlier, but it'll be still kind of a slow and steady rebound. Continuing to see and monitor the shift from online retail or sort of brick and mortar retail activity to online retail. And hopefully some of our departmental services like the library and Parks and Rec returning to some new normal, providing more routine, more regular types of services to the community. Next slide, please. So that was on the revenue side. On the expenditure side, again, we continue to see growth in our general fund expenditures. Like we've talked already about sort of the cost of living adjustments. Those that are already negotiated with our labor unions have already been included in our multi-year forecast. We're not assuming any additional cost of living adjustments or anything like that at this time. We have incorporated all of the known increases for medical premiums and our CalPERS pension costs, which I've described earlier. And then we made assumptions about ongoing inflationary increases for construction projects and other similar types of expenditures. Next slide, please. So when you put it all together on the revenue side, this is what our multi-year forecast looks like. This graph shows our major general fund tax revenues, what they've been over the past few years, what we're projecting for the current fiscal year, and then what we think those revenues will be in fiscal year 22 and fiscal year 23. Again, showing property tax growing and sort of the slow and steady, kind of very slow rebounding of these other general fund taxes. Next slide, please. So this table here summarizes the projected revenues and expenditures in the general fund in fiscal year 22 and fiscal year 23. And when you do the math, what the net loss is in both of those years based on the known expenditure increases and what we were projecting for revenue, and what the ending reserve balance will be in the general fund if this was to occur. So in fiscal year 22, it shows that our revenues will come in, are projected to come in around $163 million with projected expenditures of $170 million. So all else being equal, with no action taken on either revenue or expenditure, we would be budgeting for an operating loss of $7.8 million, which would require the use of reserves in order to balance the budget and continue normal operations. Next slide, please. So I have a few graphs here that show the impact on the reserves based on this multi-year forecast modeling. So this graph here shows in the red line what our expenditures are projected to be during those two forecast years. That's the red line. Those are our expenditures. The green dotted line are the revenues in both of those years. And so where expenditures are higher than our revenues, it requires the use of reserves to balance the budget. And you can see the gray bar, the gray column is our reserve balance. And so during the forecast years, our reserves are actually declining because of that structural imbalance in our budget, in our multi-year forecast. Next slide, please. This is another take on our reserves. So I mentioned earlier that, per city council resolution, per policy, we target to retain approximately 25% of our annual operating expenditures in reserve. So the bars, the columns in gray shows the 10% budget reserve target, and the blue portion of that column is our disaster reserve target at 15%, both of them equaling 25%. Well, during the forecast period, that black line going down shows how far off we are on our reserves, showing an ending fund balance much lower than what the required reserve balance is. Next slide, please. So staff have reviewed this multi-year forecast. We've held a number of internal meetings to discuss it and review it. And departments are currently in the process of developing their budget proposals and getting ready to work with the city administrator on reviewing them and getting ready for public meetings with the city council in the coming months here. And one direction that departments are currently working to achieve is to articulate what it would take to identify 5% of departmental operating reductions in order to help balance the budget. That was a strategy that the city used in balancing its current fiscal year budget in fiscal year 2021. And if we are to achieve 5% savings in fiscal year 2022, that helps tremendously at achieving a balanced budget. You can see that would generate about $6.8 million worth of savings in fiscal year 22, which would only leave a remaining $1.4 million of a deficit in that year. So that is a strategy that is currently being worked on by staff. We'll be working with the city administrator in fleshing that out, and we'll be getting ready to present that to the city council in the coming months. Next slide, please. So here is our budget calendar. So we've been working on our multi-year forecast, and our budget kickoff process already occurred. Over the next couple of months, departments will continue to develop their budget proposals and work with the city administrator on reviewing them, understanding the ramifications on our general fund reserves, making preliminary funding recommendations on capital projects, and working on balancing the budget. And then beginning in April, the city will file its budget, and then first start reviewing it with the Finance Committee, and be making multiple presentations in multiple public venues to assist the City Council with their deliberations, and then eventually adopting the budget in June. And then we will proceed to implement the budget and the City Council's priorities that you tell us to work on. And with that, I think I'm happy to take questions or accommodate any discussion, Madam Mayor, or if the City Administrator wants to come on for the next section, that would be great too. Thank you.
I was just absorbing your calendar. Are there any questions from the city council members so far? That was a pretty thick presentation. I really appreciate your forecasting and looking at the job market and all kinds of stuff here. I don't see anyone popping on. Maybe this would be a good time to take a break. Mr. Casey, do you have a recommendation? You're doing the, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you, Mr. DiMartini. Yeah, that was 2 hours of really in-depth analysis. Appreciate his presentation. He's getting up to speed so well in 6 months. And there's a lot of great staff that work underneath all that across all the departments and in the finance department that support that. So thanks to everyone who assisted. My recommendation, Madam Mayor, let's take a short break. I'll come back and talk about workload priorities quite quickly, and then get into your comments and suggestions and public comment and wrap it up.
Yeah, don't forget our public comment. Okay, we'll take a 10-minute break, meeting in recess. February 11, 2021 meeting of the Santa Barbara City Council, our budget work session for fiscal year 2022. Mr. Casey, you were going to talk to us about workload priorities. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So this is just the summation of the staff presentation, then we'll turn it over to you for any comments, suggestions, or questions that you might have. What I want to do relatively briefly is just show you the scope and magnitude of the policy work that is going on citywide through all your departments. I think it's meeting a lot of your ongoing goals and efforts, and I think it's a really impressive list to show the breadth and scope of what we're working on. So if you go to the next slide, please. Well, I'll have a number of slides, about 4 slides, going through somewhat thematically, but a lot overlap and kind of belong together, but just for simplicity, we put them into different areas. But on this page, you know, this is a lot of all of your planning work that you've been working on. And so it's long-range planning, it's housing, it's economic recovery, it's downtown revitalization, and it's homeless. In community development, it's multi-departmental, but the development of the downtown master plan is going to be a huge effort. And you'll have a report coming shortly from the subcommittee that's working on that. We continue to implement the NOVAC report. We're working on the housing policies downtown that you've directed, dealing with state laws about multi-unit objective design standards. Historic resources is coming up with the ordinance committee, and of course trying to deal with the Ortega and the Nordstrom vacant buildings and redevelopment opportunities there. All those real top council priorities. Economic recovery kind of blends in with that, the coordination with all of that, dealing with tenant displacement issues, and community education and communication on COVID and vaccination and economic recovery continues to be a priority. Housing. We got affordable housing policies and procedures. We're dealing with mobile home ordinance. We're streamlining the environmental review, and we're getting started on the housing element update and dealing with the regional housing needs assessment, or RHNA process, and starting to work for that. And then of course, homeless is a real priority for the community, for the business community, for neighborhoods, for all of us. We gave you a pretty comprehensive presentation in December about our work with SB Act and CityNet, and continuing that effort into the next year, and continue to have a focus to see what we as a city can do with a really challenging problem, and how we can work with our partners, because it's more than just the city's effort on that. Next slide, please. Then of course you have all the world of public works and all the capital planning that's going on in the water and wastewater work. We continue with bridge replacements. We have that wonderful ATP grant for Las Positas MODOC that's putting in the multi-use pathway that's under construction. Conversations continue with the community on Mission Canyon Bridge, working on the bike paseos. The State Street Underpass is starting to come together. That's another one of those great grants that just takes a few years, but making that connection between downtown and the waterfront, that could also fall under that economic development and downtown revitalization. And then a lot of water and wastewater work, as example. We created a new department of sustainability and resiliency, and that has been a real priority for council, and you can see a lot of really interesting work going on under that section. We've got the local coastal program amendments that could fall under community development are here. Sea level rise adaptation is a multi-departmental effort. Climate action planning. The community choice energy rollout is coming this fall, and that's a big deal. And so we will see that coming. You gave direction to move on the REACH codes for building electrification, strategic energy plan, climate action plan, carbon neutrality. Mentioned that, electric vehicle master planning. So a lot of great work meeting your goals in the climate sustainability area. Next slide, please. And then other departments also doing a lot of work. Airport, we've got new services coming in, not only Southwest, but bringing on new United and Delta services as well. And so good opportunities as we recover out of the pandemic for people to move across the country when it's safe to do so. Airport minimum standards update. So we're dealing with the flight school issue. You've heard a lot from the different entities out there. We've, I think, achieved kind of an agreement on a status quo for right now while we move forward then with these minimum standards, which will help address the conflict that's been out there at the airport. And then just lease negotiations, working on the FBOs, the fixed base operator planning. That's a major effort that is going to be coming up, as well as the Southfield development area. Police, you just had a comprehensive update from the police chief. And so she laid out a lot of the major issues going on with police and fire services. She focused on police, but then also fire body worn cameras, rolling that out is a big deal. The deemed approved alcohol ordinance with the city attorney's office is making its way through the planning commission and will come to ordinance committee and council. Always a focus on police officer recruitment and retention. And then the fire department, you just had major presentation on the community wildfire protection plan. Regional dispatch studies will continue, implementing their 5-year strategic plan, et cetera, et cetera. Next slide, please. Library services, a lot of great work, even with the library physically closed going on at the library. We're going to give you an update in a month or two on the Library Plaza Capital campaign. A little teaser. It's going great. The community is really stepping up. We're super excited about the ability to have that public-private partnership to help fund a new library plaza in downtown. And again, that could have gone into downtown and economic recovery as well. Working on expansion of the early learning and the stay and play program at the West Side. That's the partnerships we've talked to you about that. Moving forward with a more user-friendly online library catalog continues to be a priority. And they'll be launching a library on the go van, and that's taking library services out to neighborhoods. And so that's something we're all looking forward to. Information technology, we'll be hiring a new director soon for that. So we're excited to have someone come in, provide leadership and vision about where we need to go from a technology standpoint. But major effort, as you know, is replacing our city's website. It's old, it's tired, it's getting past its prime. And so keeping this, what has now become kind of the lifeblood of our communication system and engagement system with the community, getting a new website as a priority, and that's going well. Parks and Recreation, always a ton of work going on in Parks and Recreation. The biggest challenge, of course, is getting ready to reestablish youth and family programs and services as it's safe to do so, getting the staffing lined up appropriately and in a timely manner, and taking the steps that when we do offer those programs that we're doing it in a safe manner. And so that will be a challenge for this coming summer, but one that we already are preparing for. Major infrastructure renewal projects at a lot of parks throughout town. Restoring Andre Clark Bird Refuge to the Creeks Department is moving forward. You'll see more about that, as well as restoration of the Arroyo Borough open space. Finance Department, you just heard 2 hours of a lot of what they do, but budget preparation and the multi-year forecast is almost a year-round effort. It's certainly about a 9-month effort for that department. Working on a utility billing system upgrade, and as just mentioned, starting to strategically look at coming up with a pension management strategy and evaluate options there. Next slide, please. Waterfront, something we're going to have to grapple with is when is it safe to welcome cruise ships back? They're starting to do multi-year planning. So we're not sure what the right answer to that is. It's not something that we're looking for tomorrow to have cruise ships back here. But at some point, as the vaccines roll out, it does become safe. It's a conversation we need to have about when that's appropriate to bring that back. And again, that's another one that could go into the economic development and recovery effort. Major maintenance of Stearns Wharf and the harbor is just an ongoing effort down there. And replacing the city pier ice house equipment is a major effort that really supports the commercial fishing industry down at the waterfront. And then, of course, looking at sediment management and the annual harbor dredging. Human resources, we're trying to do a lot of social equity training within the organization. And so they are working on a diversity, equity, and inclusion program. They're doing an employee engagement initiative, and employee training and onboarding in a COVID world as we bring new staff on, and an anti-harassment training for all employees. And of course, they are our lead in labor negotiations as we work through this budget, coinciding with our labor discussions and our labor partners. Next slide, please. And finally, city administration, the clerk's office, and the city attorney's office. We've got a number of really significant efforts coming up. We have to do redistricting once we get the census data. So that's a once every 10-year process laid out in the Banala settlement. So that is starting to come up next fiscal year. We've got an election this November. This is the last odd year election. We're going to contract with the county, but there's still a lot of work that we have to do here within City Hall and with the clerk's office to help facilitate and manage that election. We will then be on even year elections consolidated with the county. Going forward from that. Kickstarting the Community Formation Commission and providing the staff oversight for that, again, multi-departmental effort. City TV is going to replace the audio system in council chambers in the Gephardt room. So that's just something that will provide better service once we're back in person in those. And then public art and kind of our work in the arts field. We'll work on guidance for special events and parades and getting those implemented and updating our public art procedures and assisting what do our festivals look like this year with kind of an uncertain rollout of the vaccines and the months in preparation and planning that has to go into them. So working with our partners in the nonprofit world with that, and also county public health, and trying to see where we go. So that's a quick snapshot. I see Mr. Colon on. He may want to add in some workload stuff, although maybe he's frozen. Yeah, I'm afraid he's frozen. It's not moving. So let me summarize, and then once he unfreezes, he can chime in. So at this point, interested in any questions you might have. We've got key department staff on board if there's anything you wanted to ask them questions for, or if there's suggestions you want us to be thinking about as we put the budget process together, this is the time to do so. Looking forward to your input, guidance, and thoughts. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Thank you. The floor is open for questions. If you could save your commentary until after public comment, Mr. Jordan, and then at some point when Mr. Colon comes back, I think he wanted to say something about his department and in the context of the budget. Mr. Jordan, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'm going to go backwards just because it's easier than me going back to where I had some questions first. So, Mr. Casey, just wanted to talk with you about 3 questions that came up in your slides. And one is on pension strategies, which I'm not going to profess to know anything about, but my understanding is that we are ultimately controlled and local strategies that we could develop by state legislation, which might not be the right phrase, but some type of rules. And so can you talk a little bit about what can we do, or what can we try to get others to do, and what those type of strategies would be?
Yes, thank you, Madam Mayor and Councilmember Jordan. Great question. So I see it as kind of a 2-part answer to your question. And one, Mr. DeMartini covered a little bit. I'd look back at slide 77 if you have the copy, but I'll read it. He's talking about financial management options to deal with our payments to CalPERS that we're required to do, our funded and unfunded liabilities. And there's options that other cities are looking at, and so we think we should as well, and that is employee cost sharing, which we've already been doing, and we're going to be discussing that with our labor units. There's a concept called the inflationary control of pay. It's just something that Mr. DeMartini could explain better than I could. You could do discretionary overpayments if for some reason we had the financial wherewithal to do so. A number of cities, especially in Orange County, have done that. Kind of prepaying down your mortgage debt is kind of the comparison there. And then there's something called pension obligation bonds, where you can issue debt and prepay your pension obligations, but with interest rates so low that may turn out to be financially favorable to the city. So these are all complicated things. We want to think about them and talk to the Finance Committee. So those are things that we can control. Those are kind of payment strategies. The only other thing I will add is still pending before the California Supreme Court is, can jurisdictions change the pension scenarios, that the pension programs that you have with employees on a go-forward basis? To date, the state Supreme Court says, no, you can't. Once it's locked in with those employees, and they have a right to that, a constitutional right to that. There are a couple pending cases that everyone's kind of watching to see if the state Supreme Court changes that. That then I think leads to a multi-year discussion at the state legislature and whether locals have the authority and conversations with labor unit groups. So I have no idea if that's going to happen. So that's not on our workload right now because there's nothing to work on because we don't have any legal guidance. But that's just one that kind of keeps floating out there that statewide people are watching. Hope that helps.
Thanks. And then kind of when I'm looking at through all the things that make us want to live here, the parks, the libraries, that kind of thing. I guess I'm just continually reflect that I know there's groups that are out in the community that play a role, like the Library Foundation, the Park Foundation. There might be other ones in some of those areas too. Do we play a big enough role in terms of our budget process and working with those groups to give them an opportunity to, one, educate themselves over, let's just pick the library, because I know Mr. Friedman can talk more to that too, that here's our constraints, and educate them on our constraints and give them the opportunity really to gear up and contribute to closing the gap between what they'd like to see and what our constraints only allow us to do. I just kind of get the feeling that in some of those areas, it's just, here's the budget, here's some charts, whatever, go forth and be happy, children. But there's this huge group of people out there, community members and stakeholders that might be ready to play with those gaps. And what's our role in that? Do we have a role? Should we have a role?
Great. Thank you, Madam Mayor, Councilmember Jordan. Good question. And I will welcome Ms. Zachary and Ms. Caliente to jump in as well, because those are the two more fundamental ones. That's the Park Foundation and the Library Foundation. And there is a decent amount that goes on there, and there is a decent amount of outside funding that comes in. And then a lot of that, though, depends on the energy of the group, and is it the right project that gets people excited and write checks to? Again, I just use as a quick example, Library Plaza, that has really captured people's imagination and excitement. And so that has worked fabulously. Cabrillo Pavilion, for some reason, people looked at that and kind of said, you city need to pay for that, but, and so they weren't as excited. And we were kind of surprised by that. So, but if you don't mind, I'd like to let the two directors of Parks and Recreation and Library talk a little bit more about your question.
We'll start with Ms. Zachary. Go ahead.
Mayor Murillo, Councilmember Jordan. Yes, you're correct. We do have the Park Foundation. The Park Foundation has played an important role over the years as a recipient of funds to support some programming efforts, which I think is in part what you're asking about. So we get funding from the Wood Claessens Foundation that helps fund about 25% of our free summer drop-in program. It's a program that costs about $80,000 and we get $37,000 from Wood Claessens. We've also had funds from the Audacious Foundation that have supported the free Learn to Swim programs at the Ortega Park pool, which is a pool that can only support small children in the summertime. We can't operate it year round. We have had friends groups in the past that give us nickels and dimes, but the cost to maintain our infrastructure is pretty significant, and we always fall short in terms of the variety of things you need to do in 60 different park and recreation facilities. And so there are times where we have great partnerships on certain programs. There are times we have good partnerships on certain projects. I would add that there's the expectation that the city, subsidizes a lot of these things as well, whether you're a pickleball player or a kid going to summer camp.
Thanks.
Ms. Caliente?
Thank you, Mayor Murillo, Councilmember Jordan. The library is very fortunate in that we have very strong support groups and they understand the need. Their role is to get us from good to great, and they really work to do that. Our Library Foundation has an endowment that they distribute to us every year. Our Friends of the Library contribute at a pretty significant level for the library. They on average give $65,000 every year. And as Mr. Casey described, the Library Plaza campaign is going really well, and that public-private partnership is flourishing. So overall, we spend a lot of time helping our supporters understand the budget constraints, understand how to advocate, how to reach the deeper pockets within the city of Santa Barbara. So it's a big portion of what we do at the library.
And And there's police foundation and fire foundations that also raise substantial
Okay.
amounts of money that help. So there are efforts. Could there be more? Always happy to have
Definitely.
more.
Ms. Cadiante, great to see you. So, and then one last one for you, Mr. Casey. When do we start recognizing sea level rise in these discussions and the costs that we know are going to come, but we don't know what they are? We're waiting for triggers as we should be, but we know we're going to have expense. I mean, when do we start to bear a little bit of that nastiness ourselves?
Thank you, Madam Mayor and Councilmember Jordan. That was the presentation we gave to you just a couple of weeks ago on sea level rise, had a 5-year adaptation plan that kind of laid out what our marching orders are. And you will see that now transition over into your capital improvement document for those that are capital based and require that. Others might be programmatic that we'll do or that we're pursuing grants for. So you will see that now populating the CIP document as follow through and implementation of that plan.
Okay, very well. And I want to get off here because it's already 3:30, but I just have one more question for Mr. DiMartini, if I may, Madam Mayor. So I just want to understand near your last slides. I have lots of questions on your prior slides too, but I can catch up with you. With the 5% reductions, you're asking of staff of next year's already proposed budget. We get down to a what would be much more manageable $1.4 million deficit for fiscal year 22, right? That's the takeaway there, instead of that big almost $8 million number, right?
Yes, Councilman Jordan, that's correct.
And that doesn't reflect anything in labor yet that may be pending. It simply reflects the city's budget as we're asking the departments to cut, but without any other considerations yet, right?
That is correct, Councilmember Jordan. So in the fiscal year 22 column, the projected column, the expenditures line includes all of the known expenditure increases that will occur in fiscal year 22 that are already included in approved labor contracts.
And then kind of the really bad news is if you look at fiscal year 23, we're right back here again, unless revenue sources take off dramatically over what you're projecting, right? We still haven't escaped.
Councilmember Jordan, I would say that, each year in our we look out 5 years for the general fund, and in each year after fiscal year 22, it's harder to predict, right? So there's still a great deal of economic uncertainty for our major general fund tax revenues, which I, kind of tried to articulate with the council and the public today. And so we will have to wait and see what impact the rebounding of, post-COVID looks like on our major general fund taxes. But this is the best that we can project at this time. I will say that the deficit is a little bit less. And so there might be some ongoing savings that could be reviewed and analyzed as part of this upcoming budget process that might have savings in the out years as well. That might be one thing that might occur. Mr. Casey, you might want to chime in as well.
Thank you, Madam Mayor and Councilmember Jordan. I tend to agree with your assumption, Councilmember Jordan, that is kind of still cautious. The multi-year is still not super bullish, but I agree with Mr. DiMartini. We're not over planning for that yet because there's so much uncertainty. What if the roaring 20s come back that people keep talking about? Some great relief, economic recovery, and a lot of federal stimulus and things do really well. Don't know. So let's see how the next 18 months kind of play out.
Disheartening. I was hoping not to see a 23 number like that. So thank you, Madam Mayor.
And just, the problem is that we do have expenses that are going like that, and the revenues.
There was an early chart on the GDP from Mr. DiMartini where it went that and like this, and then it said, "Ooh, look, we're going to grow by 12%." Well, the 12% line itself was really where the GDP would have been if we hadn't dipped down there. And that's the problem is salaries and wages, programs and services, capital costs, repairs, just go at their own pace regardless of what happens to your revenues. All that just keeps going. And that's the hard part. So thank you, Madam Mayor.
Thanks. Ms. Sneddon, I saw you pop on a minute ago. Your turn with question.
I'll wait until after public comment. I can wait. Thank you.
Not a bad idea. Any other questions at this point? Ms. Gorman, then let's go to public comment because there will be time for any lingering questions and commentary after that. Mr. Gutierrez, you're on for public comment, or did you? Okay, thanks.
Very good. Thank you so much. We'll pull up our timer. Daryl Sheck will be speaking. There are 2 other persons who have logged on. If you would like to speak, please raise your hand or send me a question within the app to let me know. Mr. Sheck, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, Mayor Murillo and City Council. My name's Daryl Sheck, SEIU Local 620 Field Representative, representing many of your fine city employees. And we were very interested in hearing the presentation and the discussion taking place related to the development of the fiscal year 2022 plan. Local 620 plans to be very active with regards to city budget discussions for the upcoming fiscal year. While we know this has been a challenging time for finances in many places, we'd like to provide council with some insights of our own in budgetary planning. Many positions that Local 620 represents have not been filled since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. This should contribute heavily to salary savings for the city for both this current year and until whenever they're filled. Our members, your employees, have been doing more with less and continue to do more with less. We are also concerned with position creep. We've recently seen many supervisory and middle management positions open for recruitment. This is a bit of a catch-22 in that we're pleased to see our members get opportunities and be successful to apply and be successful in those recruitments. However, filling these positions and not others that have been lost due to attrition doesn't seem right. In addition, the city has lost many good long-term employees to other agencies recently as our members are being poached for their great experience when they're not allowed to promote at the city. We ask you to be wary of the numbers and ratios of supervisors and managers to line staff and ask yourself how flat of an organization is optimal in providing city services. We ask you to make those that we represent a priority in the year and years ahead. We think that last year, for the first time in many years, our members actually kept up with the cost of living. We believe the work put into the current agreements help promote stability, but we need to keep the ball rolling. We need the city to remain committed to honoring the terms of our current agreements and making adjustments where necessary to remain competitive in wages and benefits. It's important that each new project be evaluated for its ongoing costs and sustainability and where our members might play a role in those projects. Sometimes it's tempting to look outside for solutions, even though the expertise may already be within the organization. And we know you have a big job in balancing those priorities and providing services to the public. Our members will have their own ideas, and we will encourage them to come forward with ideas of how to optimize city services and save money. We won't hesitate to engage you in the near future on those ideas. And no respect to Mr. DiMartini, but often finance directors can be somewhat conservative with their estimates and projections. I would just encourage you to continue to ask plenty of questions where these estimates and projections come from and the assumptions underlying them. And we look forward to providing more feedback in the future. We'd also like to see a link to the copy of this presentation, as we didn't see one in the original council packet. Thank you very much for your time today and your service. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Sheck. Another speaker?
Madam Mayor, no further speakers have raised their hands or otherwise indicated that they wish to speak.
Okay, we'll close public comment then and go to commentary. Ms. Sneddon, I know that you have to be for sure gone at 4, so if you want to start.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So the first thing I want to say is, wow, I think in these really sort of trying times, I mean, beyond trying times with budget and crisis, to see all of these workload priorities laid out and to see that Mr. Casey have continued to hold our priorities up and move them forward and grow in some areas, not financially, but in creating the new departments of sustainability and resilience. And I was happy to see reference to sea level rise in there and funding for that. And in just so many ways, I think I just wanted to acknowledge that was a really thorough, all the way through. Mr. DeMartini and Mr. Casey in this presentation. I think, I don't know, I'm really looking at it and feeling like, wow, the city is doing a lot and keeping things going. And I'm really appreciative of that. So the main things I want to just say, I think, I believe, I just want to say some of my priorities. I see most of my priorities, all of my priorities actually reflected in these workload priorities. I want to emphasize those that I think in the long run will actually benefit the city and make the city be able to retain more in the general fund. And one of those is, as you all know, I feel so firmly about the downtown master plan. I think with careful planning and good planning on that will actually increase our revenue. And I am looking forward to our economic development plans and how those might help to rebuild some of those reserves eventually, but recognizing we're in difficult times. I think we received a colleague memo. I want to voice my support, my hearty support for it's pretty small amount asked to be worked in. I think it's $15,000 for the completion of a child care study needs assessment. And I think that would be beneficial for the whole city. Childcare needs, I think, get people back to work and are supportive in that. So I think that's important. This 5% departmental reductions, I know Mr. Casey and I've spoken about it. I know we spoke about it last round too. And I know there's a lot of care taken into each department, but really emphasizing that some departments that are so much smaller, Department of One versus much larger departments, to really be looking at, if you've already had a 5% reduction and now you're at the point where you're not using paper anymore, this is hyperbole, but then you have to take another 5% reduction. Some departments really will be debilitated by that. So I already know that that's going to be taken into account, but I want to lay that out now as people are preparing those budgets, that maybe they could know ahead of time which ones might not really be able to do that without just decimating the department. And something that comes to mind too, our newly formed Sustainability and Resilience Department is a staff of one person. And from what I think that's still the case, it originally intended to have a staff, increased staff, but has been operating with a staff of one. And so to take a decrease on that, what does that even do? I don't even know, but we'll look at those later. But I just want to voice that really small departments, city clerk's office, sustainability and resilience, when you have departments of one person, that we really look at that a little bit differently. Overarching, it's important to me to prioritize people. I understand, and we had full discussion about, as you mentioned, Madam Mayor, the kiosketeers. I don't want to move towards efficiency in a way that depletes our workers, and whatever is possible to retain workers, maybe in different capacity for a while and then back to their original capacity, to the speaker and Mr. Scheck, and that we need to be made whole with our own employees. And that's just going to be an overarching request of mine, that we not make savings by eliminating positions. I just really don't want to see that happen more. And then one more thing, I think it's time to really have a thorough look at our partnerships. The ones that I'm thinking of, we're in the habit of sort of renewing support for, and some of them we get more return on our investment in that, and some we might want to look at what are we achieving and maybe what we could do in-house. And I don't have predeterminations of what would happen by looking at these, but what come to mind are downtown organization, Chamber of Commerce, County Office of Arts and Culture, Visit Santa Barbara. Some are much more thorough when they come to us about what it is that's benefiting the city. In my mind, I see Untouchable, Solstice, Film Festival, and Earth Day. But I think we have partnerships all throughout that we sort of renew that funding to, that we may want to consider. Could we be more efficient and do some of that in-house? So yes, my support for the childcare needs assessment, and then those other priorities on there. And really, this was a phenomenal presentation. Thank you.
Before we go to Mr. Friedman, I just want to explain to the public the memo that Councilmember Sneddon was referring to. Mr. Casey, go ahead and tell us what it is.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Mayor. So Councilwoman Harmon could not make the meeting today, and she had one item that she had been planning to bring forward. And so she sent a memo to council, and I'll just summarize it right now for you. And it's something that we can consider as we develop the budget and bring it forward. But she's looking at the city of Goleta and the city of Santa Barbara funding a regional childcare needs assessment and planning study with the local nonprofit. I'm not sure the local nonprofit's been identified quite yet. The city's contribution would be $15,015, and City of Goleta will look to do something, I think, in that ballpark as well. And so she submitted a memo to you. It's quite eloquent in explaining her needs and desires and request for it. So she wanted to get that in front of you all. And again, we will bring that forward as part of the budget as a consideration for you all to look at funding at the $15,000 level.
Mr. Casey, if your staff could post that memo, there was a request from Mr. Scheck to post the PowerPoint presentation related to this hearing. If those could go on the website, that would be good for the public. Thank you.
Will do.
Mr. Friedman, your remarks, please.
All right, thank you, Madam Mayor. First, I would just like to thank again, Mr. DiMartini and all your staff for the great work. I think this shows a lot of thought and a lot of analysis went into this. And this is your first go around here. And I also want to thank Jennifer Tomaszewski. I know last year you helped get us through that last year. Took the lead on this. And so I know that you put a lot of effort into this as well. So to both of you and all of your staff, really appreciate the numbers and looking at this and having us a map to go forward on both revenues and expenditures. There's just a lot of great information that was presented today. First, I'll start off with the issue of partnerships that Councilmember Jordan referenced. Yes, we should look to how we can enhance those partnerships, especially in terms of specific projects. As you mentioned, I have been involved with the Library Plaza project going back many years. Back when I was on the Library Advisory Board, I think almost 15 years ago is the first time we actually had a presentation with it on there. So, but it takes a lot of time to cultivate those relationships between whether it's council members and city and those partners, but also to cultivate a specific project that can get around there. So I think that's one of the that's why the Library Plaza project has been so successful, is there's been both of those, the cultivation of a specific project that the community really has the benefit, but also years long cultivating relationships to understand how we can work together on that. So I think the Library Foundation and the Plaza project are an example of what can be done. So I'm happy to talk more offline with anybody who wants to talk about that. So two items or three that I'm going to consider, or specifically two. One is I do fully support Councilmember Harmon's request for childcare. I think it's an obvious need as a parent myself, going through that. And I know there's a lot of parents that are struggling and will continue to struggle, especially in light of as we emerge from this. So I fully support that. And I want to thank Goleta Councilmember James Kyriakos, because I understand he's been working on that from the Goleta end. And so there's two things aside from the work plan. I think it's great, all the work that we're doing, and I want to thank all our staff in the city. As you can see, we have a great staff that are really doing a lot of different things making our city run. So the first is a project that I've been working on with council members Alejandra and Oscar Gutierrez, and our park staff, and also the school district. And we had tried last year prior to COVID to possibly have something this past summer, but of course it got delayed. And so we think that the timing is right to really look at that project again. And it's a family youth summer program and activities that would go into the West Side as a pilot program. And where in the summer, in the late afternoons and the evenings, there would be opportunities for families to come together. There'd be activities through our Parks Department and neighboring businesses. And by the summer of 22, we think we can work with the school district, and we've been meeting with them and they're enthusiastic about it. So I would just like to, when the budget comes back, our deliberations later in May, to have that program, just some information from our staff on what it would take, because I'd like to have that considered as part of the budget, but we need more information, whether it's part of the parks budget or an outside. That's up to you, Mr. Casey, and how you want to present that, but it is something I'd like to move forward. Another one is, it came out of a case earlier this year, but the dangerous dog ordinance, just updating that and having that updated, whether it's part of the work plan for next year or whether there's an opportunity now to do it. I just want to raise that issue. I think it's important that we address it, and with our animal control and how that would get addressed. Again, I'm not sure if it's a process that's already underway or could be, or if it's part of the work plan, but just want to put that out there. It's something I would support. And then the third item, in addition to all this, is maybe not for next fiscal year, but as an ongoing conversation, is our arts. I think Councilmember Sneddon, you triggered my memory on that, that I wanted to bring this up because we're talking about the different partnerships we have. And I think maybe we do look at our support for the arts, and are we optimally the way we're structured right now, working with the county, working with our arts nonprofits and communities to really maximize, because there is a huge return on investment with that. And as we come out of COVID, there's going to be a strong desire for arts. So just looking at our systems and how we might be able to improve them, but just throwing that out there again. And then the last thing I would say is it's very in line with Councilmember Sneddon's comments on the proposal for 5%, is really looking at strategically, department by department, not an across the board. There's some departments that are very small. There's others that have also, they have in the past given a lot. So I think that also needs to be taken into consideration, but really looking at the service, what it means to the city, and really going department by department, more surgical rather than just all off the top. So those are my comments. And again, thank you to our staff for really putting this forward and giving us a roadmap to weather this this unfortunate downturn that we have in the finances due to the pandemic. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Friedman. Thanks. Mr. Jordan, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'll just go quickly back before I get to any of mine that I had prepared on Councilmember Sneddon's and Friedman's. I also agree with the hardly any money for a great return on the childcare study. I think it's long overdue. Both Ms. Sneddon and Mr. Friedman talked about partnerships and returns, and my kind of stance on that is there's groups out there or there's stakeholders out there, and we know about them and they know about us, but generally we miss an opportunity to get them involved early, and then they find out late that something's not happening or something's broken when they could have helped early. And I just think we need to continue to look for opportunities early on with our partnerships and groups that would be involved for niche areas, let's say. Mr. Friedman mentioned he's happy to chat that up with anybody. So am I. I have a particular interest in Parks and Rec as a background, and just where I live is a particular Parks and Rec mecca in this district too. So, but I'm willing to put in some time on that. In returns to looking at groups that we give money to, I'm interested in making sure that we're really balancing the return on investment of the dollar we give to those groups, because the return we get in revenue also benefits the other groups that we're not necessarily directly giving money to. So for me, a real hard look at where we're actually just making a discretionary decision on to give money. And, you know, I know everything's relative, but to me, groups that generate money back to the city, that allows the city to do stuff with other groups with those resources, are really important to the success of the city. then I just have a couple things that I had coming in. One, I'd like to get to a point where they're in kind of the big budget picture or structure or where we're moving forward, where we actually start to take a harder look or a more focused look at use of the, what is it? We have 10 downtown surface lots in the city of Santa Barbara, and the role the city can play in keeping those a parking asset that generates parking funds, but also begins to look at housing on top of those, and not in a manner that takes away those assets from downtown parking, but that enhances the revenue of downtown parking. I think the longer we wait, the farther we get behind. We would be saying the same thing about a private party that just had a lot doing nothing with it and was underdeveloped. And I think we start by leading, and we can control most of the math on those projects. So I don't know where that fits in the budget discussion, but it just seems time to talk about it. And unfortunately, yesterday we were informed that we lost a couple state grants that were key to both District 1 and District 2, having to do with mainly pedestrian and bicycle safety and modifications to traffic lanes. I'd be interested in, when we start to grind down in this on the capital budget, that we look at trying to break off some chewable parts of those big projects that were envisioned getting grant funds and work on some of the littler parts ourselves, in particular crosswalks enhancements on Milpas, other places on the east side, and crosswalk enhancements mainly on Cliff Drive on the Mesa. And then finally, my only other little wish list item is that we continue to fund what I think are highly successful efforts on homeless outreach and homeless choices, particularly with SB Act and CityNet. I know we increased their funding this year through a couple pathways. I think some of it our money, some of it other people's money. I think there's just a fantastic amount of enthusiasm and momentum going with that process right now. And I would hate when we turn the year in July to see their funding drop off and not recognize that part of that momentum was the extra funds we brought to them this year. So I'd be interested in maintaining that. To that effort too, Madam Mayor, if you'll just give me a minute to go off on a tangent. We're front loading the process successfully for dealing with the homeless. We have been bolstering up the SB Act and CityNet type of resources, but we continue not to look at the end of that pathway, and that is what makes a unhoused person housed, and that is housing. We eventually might even be in the fortunate or unfortunate situation where we're already there, but it might get worse, much worse, where we have many, many, many more people waiting to get into some type of housing, whether that's a shelter, bridge housing, or permanent supportive housing, and there's just nothing available. We've put the resources in the front part of the equation, but we haven't really taken a step to the back part of the equation. You will all, my fellow council members and mayor, you will be getting a visit from me to talk about an ask that I will make on a structured role we can play to approach getting involved with providing the resources for housing, shelter housing, bridge housing, and permanent supportive housing, so that we don't just mess up this path, that we continue to make sure we're making strides in developing the relationships, nudging people along, setting them up for housing, but we make sure that there's housing there at the end of that path. It's going to be a moment, I think, where we go from what I call management of problems, where we're just kind of arranging the jigsaw puzzles around, but we haven't put them together then. And we're, in my opinion, we're going to get asked to play a leadership role and make a decision that puts the pieces together and comes up with an end product. So it will also take a city commitment, probably of some funding, and it will take a leadership commitment, I think, of the 7 of us. So thank you for letting me get off on the tangent, and those are my comments.
Well, your comments really do coincide with SB Act's common agenda. Part of the common agenda is creating or facilitating more housing production for our homeless residents. So we'll plug into that. I really appreciate your comments, Mr. Jordan. Ms. Gutierrez, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I just want to thank the Finance Director and Ms. Jennifer for all of the work they've done, and Ms. Jennifer, the work she did last year. This presentation was wonderful. Being new on council and new to this whole system, this presentation was very easy on the eye, very easy to understand. So I'm really happy that the public is going to be able to see this presentation. But I wanted to echo what I'm definitely in agreement with Councilmember Jordan. I would like to see more accountability of where our funds are going, and maybe revisit some of the properties that the city owns that are being rented out, and see if we can raise, the rent on some of these properties. I know that's something people don't want to hear, but for those properties that we rent them for $1, just to see, and then also look into the cannabis and see how we can, see if we can get some revenue from a little bit more from there, because we are going to be facing a real economic crisis, and we're feeling it now. And I think the city needs to be prepared that change is going to happen. But I do agree with Mr. Jordan saying that instead of being reactive to the issues, we definitely need to start looking into the future and creating a long-term plan to really tackle some of these issues. And I also would like for our resources, the outside resources that we use and funding to really align ourselves with those resources. The city has a lot of resources that we can use to help some of the issues that we have. For example, youth violence, or now that we don't have that state funding for District 2 and 1, look at the resources that we have in the city. So I just wanted to thank staff and just make the public aware that change is going to happen. And it's, but as we come together as a community and start thinking in the future and long-term plans, a good strategy plan where we align resources, we can really tackle some of the issues that we have today. Thank you.
Thank you. Mayor Pro Tem Gutierrez, are you there?
Yes, madam. I'd like to also support the child care needs assessment plan that Councilmember Harmon has proposed, and also supporting the summer youth programs that Mr. Friedman and Alejandra Gutierrez and I have been trying to get going. The only other thing I'd like to add is I would also like to ask for a needs assessment and planning study for whether or not the city could provide internet for the residents. I just been getting a lot of comments over the years from residents about how it's not fair that we only have one internet provider for our city. And I just want to see whether or not the city could provide it, because I know other cities are doing it. So that's the only thing I would like to add, and see if anybody else would be willing to look into. Other than that, I think it was a great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, we could look at what the cost of that would be. I think I support that. Also, I support the childcare proposal. And to echo some of what Councilmember Sneddon said about prioritizing people when I've been having these discussions about the losing the kiosk workers, actually there's 80 and it's coming down to 20. 20 of them will continue to roam the parking lots and still provide some customer service. But my thought was that we could, if we look at the youth apprenticeship program or some of the other youth job training programs that are on hold because of pandemic, that if we were to backfill any kind of jobs that led young people into city employment, that would be a place that we look to, because there's a loss of that coming through the hourlies who work in the kiosks. If there's a way that we could provide a meaningful replacement, I would be grateful. And then along those same lines about automation taking away people's jobs, if we could cost out, what would it cost to do a review working with SEIU actually and the public safety unions? What looking into the future, how might automation take away people's jobs so that we can plan for it, or at least be aware that something's coming, and so that we can make sure that people are directed into other positions and take the herd out of it, I guess is what I'm thinking. And of course, we have to emphasize pandemic recovery. And the only other thing that I would say is that I'm not adding a whole lot to the list. We can't. We're not flush with money right now. And it was a sobering presentation, actually, where other years we've come away with some extra money, and we would put half of it into reserves. We would put half of it into road repair, and we're just not there. We're actually looking at a deficit. So I would close by saying that if we're in recovery, that I would like to make sure that our employees who didn't get a raise last year, that there might be something for them. That would be my priority. All of our employees, general service and public safety, that should be a priority, is making sure that they get their modest raises when it's possible. So those are my comments. Mr. Casey or Mr. DeMartini, did you have Alejandra Gutierrez? Go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Sorry, I forgot to actually emphasize one of my things that I would like to start planting the seed. I know we're not going to be able to work on it this year, but now that we are having discussions and we're looking into investing into downtown and revitalizing it again, one of my biggest goal is to start, refreshing the Milpa Street and the businesses there in the street. So we didn't get the state grant, but I am definitely going to start working and talking to people on how we can also invest in refreshing the infrastructure of Milpa Street. So I just wanted to put it out there.
Thank you so much. Mr. Casey, your closing remarks, please.
Thank you, Madam Mayor and council members. Really good input. I have a few kind of summary comments, and a lot of you, I think this was a really great chance for you to kind of compare notes, some longer term goals that you're interested in and what you're individually going to be working on and bringing back to the council. This was a great communication opportunity to kind of share all that. And so staff, we wrote notes about that as well. So appreciate that. Just a few themes that I'll respond to. One, the childcare requests seem to have very strong support, and it's a very minor dollar amount. In a partnership with Goleta, we'll find a way to make that happen. Staff's been looking at the animal control ordinance as well. We have an outdated ordinance, and so I think that's something you'll see staff wanting to bring forward to you. I'll work with the police department. The county has a good updated ordinance. There's a few other cities that have good ordinance as well. So we have easy things to kind of pull from to bring us up into times. And so we'll work on a workload within the department about when to bring it forward, but we'll do that because we think that's the right thing to do from the staff standpoint. interesting conversation. And I think it's fair on the accountability of our outside organizations. I'll work with Ms. Johnson, who's kind of our liaison with a lot of them. A lot of them have been put in line item into the budget. And so there isn't a lot of analysis that goes in every year. I heard a number of you saying, let's just take a fresh look and make sure we're getting what we need. And so we'll strategize a way to do that and work with those organizations about that. The summer youth programming, we'll talk about that when Parks and Recreation comes back. I hear that support there. Just real quick, Mr. Gutierrez has been, Councilmember Oscar Gutierrez has been asking me for information on the internet issue. I've had staff just kind of looking into it. What I might suggest is let us kind of finish that analysis and provide a memo to the whole council about what we're finding, about what other cities are doing and what options are to pursue, and give you all kind of that baseline information in written form. And then you can decide if you want to keep pursuing that or not. And then certainly heard the theme about automation and positions. Totally hear you. I appreciate Mr. Scheck's comments. I agreed with 99% of them, actually all of them. Can't appreciate staff more, how hard they have worked over this year. He's absolutely right that we've held positions open to get those savings to help balance the budget. That's how a lot of the people made their 5% departmental rejections. And that means the remaining staff have to kind of pick that up in a really tough climate. I can't be more proud of the city staff across the organization about how they've done that. Thank you. Very good comments. And I hope you got value out of the meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Casey. I'll close the meeting by saying that we do not have a city council meeting next Tuesday because of the President's Day holiday. So we will reconvene on Tuesday, February 23rd. Thank you to staff and my council members for the good discussion today. Meeting adjourned.